Okay, at this time then, it being 6 something, I'll call the meeting to order. It is a Brant County Council meeting, a special meeting. You have a revised agenda in front of you with an addendum. We will be going in camera with an item that's been added. For those that didn't get the addendum, we will be going in camera. Are there any other additions to the agenda before we begin? Seeing none, I would like a motion to receive the agenda, please. Councillor Coleman, seconded by Councillor Pierce. Any other questions to the agenda with the addendum and the in-camera session as part of the addendum? Seeing none, all those in favor? Thank you. Number 3 is the declaration of pecuniary interest. Does anyone have one that's obvious that they can talk to now, or are you going to bring them up when need be? Seeing no hands, I'm assuming there are none. Delegations, we'll go right to 4.1, please. Robert Walters.
Yes, Your Worship. Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I think the clerk says a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm Robert Walters. I'm a senior associate with Weston Consulting, and I represent 2 clients with lands in Cainesville. The first is Danny DeDominicus, which is known as Site 4A at 95 Old Onondaga Road East in Cainesville, which is 19.4 hectares, and I'll talk about the specifics of that in a minute. The second client is a numbered company, 218-1618 Ontario Incorporated, which is a professional developer known as Site 4B in Cainesville, which are land north of 366 County Road 18. Next slide, please. Before we get into the specific sites, I wanted to talk about a couple of slides that staff are going to show you, and this is one of them. Essentially what this slide says is that Cainesville, which is the third bullet point there, the Cainesville employment area is part of a rural employment area. So we've been classified rural. We are not urban employment, and urban employment is only Paris and St. George. And you'll see from the second last bullet on this slide that the purpose of the assessment that you're being given to this evening is really to look at the employment area land needs as far as the urban employment area goes. It doesn't really focus on the rural area, which is where my clients are. Next slide, please. This is another slide that you'll be shown. And again, it deals with the urban employment area land needs to 2051. And you can see from this that you'll be told that there's a deficit in the urban employment area lands of about 103 gross hectares, which again does not apply to areas like Cainesville. And in talking to staff, it's our understanding that this deficit is really a deficit of prestige employment area. And my clients' lands in Cainesville are really planned and zoned for general heavy industrial. So that's not the target area for prestige. You'll also be advised tonight that out of all the vacant employment lands in the county, 44% of those vacant lands are in the rural employment area. And you'll also be advised that the take-up demand for that to the year 2051 is somewhere between 13 and 17% every 5 years. So when you look at all that, it looks like there's an oversupply of employment land in the rural employment area. Next slide, please. This is a copy of the county's land use schedule as part of their current official plan. And my client's Site 4A is shown there at 19.4 hectares and Site 4B at 64.5 hectares. As you can see, the current official plan designates these lands employment area, and Site 4A to the north is currently zoned agricultural. And we've checked on the provincial mapping. It is not prime agricultural, but it is agricultural, which does not currently implement the employment area policies. Site 4B to the south is split zoned, and it's important to note that the frontage lands on County Road 18 are actually zoned now as of right for heavy industrial use. So these are uses that permit chemical and pharmaceutical companies. They're uses with potential noxious impact in terms of noise, odor, and vibration, and certainly would generate complaints from the suburban residential area to the west if they were developed. And again, the rear portion of those lands are zoned agricultural and again, and not considered prime agricultural. So why are these lands appropriate for residential development? Well, we have provided to council and to staff copies of our planning rationale, which outline why we think the conversion of these lands would satisfy the provincial policy statement and the policies in the city's, the county's current official plan. We think that development of these lands for residential land or residential uses would absorb some of the pressure that you're getting for residential development in St. George and Paris as well. These lands under the county's current official plan are not considered priority employment areas because they are not near Highway 403 or Highway 2, for example. And even though they're adjacent to the CNR corridor, there's only one property to the north that's actually utilized that with a spur line. So that doesn't seem to be an attracting factor. We're told by both our clients that there has been no interest in developing these lands for industrial uses since at least 2008. And the owner of Site 4B, as I mentioned, is a professional developer who believes there's a market for low-density residential uses on their property. Both these properties are in the fringe of the employment area in Cainesville, and they abut the current primary settlement area boundary. So their removal would not negatively impact the existing industrial lands to the north. These are basically self-contained lands. It's also important to note that in speaking with the county project manager for servicing, we've been told that servicing of our clients' lands is a priority and that servicing will be available in the next 3 years as part of the class environmental assessment, which is underway to extend services from the city of Brantford. And that if county council agrees that conversion is appropriate here, that the services which are coming into the area can be sized for residential use. We also note that, as I mentioned previously, there are existing suburban residential lands on the west side of County Road 18 that you see on this plan in the beige there. And certainly heavy industrial use is not compatible with that area. And in fact, the current official plan designation of the zoning does not meet the Ministry of the Environment, Energy and Conservation and Parks MOE D6 guidelines for the separation of industrial and sensitive land uses. We believe that both these properties can be properly developed for residential development in terms of being integrated with road connections and trails within the buffers around the natural heritage systems that you see there in green. And County Road 18 is designed to carry the volumes of traffic which would be generated for residential development in this area. And we also note that residential development on these lands would be more compatible with the natural heritage features than the currently slated heavy and general industrial uses. And lastly, these lands are within proximity of residential lands in the city of Brantford, and they represent a logical extension. We've estimated that between the two properties, somewhere between 1,287 and 1,663 single, semi, and street townhouse units could be developed on these lands. That essentially concludes my presentation this evening. I just request that members of council be cognizant of the issues that we've raised here and be aware that these lands are not part of the deficit that's being discussed by staff. They're not in the urban employment area, they're in the rural employment area. And certainly consider these points when you're looking at our conversion request. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Why were two of those slides or pieces of that presentation not correct before it was brought to delegation? Why aren't they correct? Why weren't they corrected before tonight? Is that a staff thing?
Well, I think, Your Worship, I think that's really, it's the way the consultant and staff have classified our lands. it does deviate from the current county official plan policies. The current official plan policies designate our clients' lands as primary urban settlement area, both in policy and on the maps. But in speaking with staff, as I understand it, Cainesville is not shown as part of the provincial growth plan, and it's not considered a strategic employment area. So they decide to reclassify it as a rural employment area. I just showed those two slides because I know they're going to be raised later in the meeting, and when they're raised, I want council members to be aware that we are in a rural area and we're not part of that deficit equation that's being presented for Paris and St. George.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. Are there any questions to the presenter? Councillor Miller, you're first, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Mr. Walters. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned your access to the 403. How long would it take to get, say, from the lands that you were talking about to the 403? I thought it was a fairly close drive, but you tell me.
It is. I haven't got to the actual measurement offhand, but it's not what we would consider prestige employment land. Usually prestige employment land likes to have actual exposure on those kinds of roadways for presentation and for advertising purposes. So it's not in that kind of situation, but certainly I mean, trucking could reach the 403 without difficulty from these lands.
Okay, you think? Yeah, no, I like you say from where I sit, I thought it was a good access, but so I was kind of surprised to hear you say that. But okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Miller. Councillor Bell, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Mr. Walters. Mr. Walters, are you aware that the last report to this committee indicated that in Paris and St. George, we have a surplus of residential lands, quite a significant surplus. So can you explain to me how this might help?
Through your worship, it's my understanding that there is some feeling by members of council that it may not be appropriate to have additional residential growth in Paris and in St. George. And we're simply offering, because our clients are interested in developing these lands in Cainesville for residential development, that if they were allowed to be converted, that could take some of the pressure off of Paris and St. George, even though there is a surplus of land. I understand that.
Councillor LaFerriere, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Robert. Mr. Walters, but by the same token, if council was to approve more residential land at the Dominicus lands, there's also potential that we just have more residential growth in both places, Cainesville and Paris, and also St. George, and all throughout the county because of the surplus. Isn't that correct?
Through your worship, I suppose that's correct, or it's a possibility, but I guess the question that we're facing is what is the most appropriate use for these lands. That our clients' lands have remained vacant for, up till the current time. There's been no interest in developing industrial uses here, and yet we have a professional developer. And I know in talking to the other landowner that he feels that because of the proximity to the city of Hamilton, that there would be no problem in developing these lands for residential use. So it's a question of what's the optimum use of the lands, and we feel residential is the optimum use.
Yeah, that's for you, Mr. Mayor. Follow up. Not a surprise a developer wants to develop lands that they own. But my question would be more to the point of, in 2008, you said that was the last time that somebody was sniffing around these lands for the potential of some industrial development. Sorry.
Well, through your worship, the old estate that either of the property owners has originally came in to acquire the lands was 2008. I'm not inferring that there was any interest then or earlier. They just don't have a history of it before 2008.
Okay, if we were to, through you, Mr. Mayor, if we were to not approve this for residential land, would there be any interest in working with our economic development team on finding industrial suitors for that space? Anything we can do as a county to help with that?
Through the worship, through your worship, I'm sure that if it was council's decision not to convert these lands to residential, which is their first choice, that they would definitely be interested in in working with your economic development department, especially since servicing is going to be coming into the area in the next 3 years.
Thank you. Are there any other questions to the presenter? Seeing none, thank you for speaking to us tonight. And
Thank
what you want to do with the delegation, Councilor Miller?
Yeah, I'll move to receive.
Thank you. Seeking a seconder. Councilor Coleman. Any other conversation, concerns? All those in favor, just to receive, please, this information. Thank you. 4.2 on the agenda, Eric. So Celestka, I bet you I butchered that. We'll just call you Eric if that's okay with you.
That's fine. It's pronounced Eric Solisla. If you're sounding it out, it's like a Y. So.
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
No problem. I get it all the time, so it's all good.
Thank you. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I have a presentation that's attached to the agenda. That's all right. Just bear with me.
Thank you.
Can you see that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mayor Bailey, members of council. My name is Eric Solisla, and I'm with GSP Group, and we're planning consultants to Green Life Proteins Limited and 2162697 Ontario Inc. And they own land in the just outside of the Cainesville area, and the total lands outlined here, approximately 162 hectares or 400 acres in area. The properties have frontage along County Road 18 and access through Papel Road. Also, there's potential for access along Johnson Road and through this unopened road allowance along here, which is identified on mapping as Papel Road. And I guess on August of 2020, on behalf of our client, we submitted a letter to Brant County planning staff requesting consideration of their land for additional industrial and employment designation, given that they're adjacent to the Cainesville area. And as you can see, the lands are predominantly used for agricultural cash cropping. There's one residential dwelling on the property out here, and there's portions of the site are wooded, and this is Fairchild Creek through here, and the lands are designated agricultural and natural heritage system in the Brant County official plan. Here's the lands here. Similarly, the lands are identified and zoned agricultural and natural heritage. We've reviewed the staff report and the Watson employment land reports, and wish to provide some additional comments for council consideration. As stated earlier, the Watson report identified the need for an additional 103 hectares of employment lands to meet the projected needs to 2051. And we feel that given these lands' proximity to the Highway 403 Garden Street interchange, we feel that it's an attractive attribute for employment uses. Also, the access through Colburn Street could be through improvement of Papel Road. Now, Colburn Street is currently a 4-lane arterial road with a center turning lane, which would lend itself really well for the connectivity through County Road 18 through Colburn Street. And additionally, the land is immediately south of the Cainesville. I'm going to call it the settlement boundary, but for the Cainesville area designated and zoned for employment and commercial uses. And additionally, there's overhead hydro service and gas line service through the Papel Road intersection and the road right away and through this area, which could provide opportunities to service future development. And as you're aware, the Cainesville Water and Wastewater Servicing Class EA is underway right now to look at long-term water and wastewater servicing to meet the demands for the 2015 horizon. And on the basis of that, you know, the lands could be potentially serviced through, you know, full municipal servicing. We've had some opportunities to have some discussions with Jennifer Boyer, and provided some supplementary information as to how the potential for boundary expansion and designation of these additional lands would meet the tests and requirements in the growth plan. And we're of the opinion that it would. And you know, additionally, what we see is happening is, you know, basically the first lands that would be developed would probably be the area immediately adjacent to the current settlement boundary, the west of the creek, and these other lands could be potentially developed in the future. But I think, you know, in terms of development opportunities, certainly the lands that have the frontage along County Road 18 would be you know, in order, and then could be determined at a future date. Oh, and one other thing that I should mention is that, you know, according to the lands, the province's agricultural soil classification mapping, predominantly the lands immediately adjacent to the lands designated industrial and employment are class 4, which aren't considered primary or prime agricultural lands. So in our opinion, these lands would be an appropriate consideration given their locational attributes for employment use, and given that they're immediately adjacent to the currently designated employment area in Cainesville. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you for your time and consideration, and I'm available for questions if you have any.
Thank you. We could just stop the screen sharing there for a minute,
Yep.
please.
Yep, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Just have to find the buttons. Yep.
There we go. There we go. First question, Councillor Gatward, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Eric. Eric, when you showed that first map and the road at the top you were referring to as County Road 18, that is the 4-lane old 403 that you're referring to?
If I pop up my screen again, if you're allowing that, just bear with me for a moment. This is the 403 here. County Road 18 is right here. This is Johnson Road. Mm-hmm. And this is Colburn Street, and then Papel Road.
Yeah. Yes, this is the new 403, and the section that you referred to as County Road 18 has been renamed because it was the old 403. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I just wanted to be clear. I don't call it County Road 18.
Are there any other questions? Oh, Councillor Gatward.
Shouldn't call it old 403. You mentioned it's class 4. That's one of the poorer classes of agricultural land, correct?
That is correct.
Is there a class 5, or is that the lowest class?
There are further classes as well. Generally, class 1 to 3 are considered prime agricultural land.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other? Councillor Miller, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the presenter, just clarify for me, like I'm an 8-year-old kid here. It's agriculture in the OP, and you want, what are you looking for? You're looking for an expansion of the settlement area so you can turn it into employment. Is that what you're asking? Yes,
that's what our client is asking. They're thinking, like, this is at the south end, or sorry, the north end of Cainesville, okay, and it's closer to the 403, and they're requesting consideration for employment designation on their lands, or a portion of their lands. So, and this is, oh yeah, I know where it is. It's in the Cainesville area, and you're saying it has good access to the 403, which it's close. It does as well, but unlike the first presenter tonight. Right. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bell, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Eric. Eric, help me. You listened to the last presentation, I think, from Mr. Walters. So we have this interesting situation where he would like to dispose of industrial land, and you would like to add it. Can you help us understand how we should address that as council?
Well, through you, Mr. Mayor, we're looking at this from the neighboring land use, and obviously this is along the south, or the north, sorry, the north part of the Cainesville area, which is closer to the 403, and there's existing access, and it's adjacent to employment land, and our client has had some interest in the past for employment use for his land. So you know, it's closer to the 403, and as I said, you know, in our opinion, it looks like it's suitable to meet the long-term needs of the employment land, and there's, you know, identified 103 hectares of employment land required to meet the 2051 employment targets set out by the province, and we feel this is appropriate area for additional employment land.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Councillor Chambers, please.
Just if you might, through the chair to the presenter, if you would maybe comment on what makes this land better than other lands in the county, because there are other areas where employment lands are currently not designated that are along the 403, for example, that may be in line for employment land designation as well. What makes your land better than the other lands?
Well, through you, Mr. Mayor, like there are some, like each site has different locational attributes to it, and I think this, you know, it's sort of on the eastern side of Brant County, and you know, it's proximate to Hamilton. It's probably closer to the Hamilton Airport, which could be seen as an attractive part of employment lands, and it's not all that far away from the Garden Street interchange at the 403 or the Garden Road. And so it's you know, it's adjacent to some existing employment uses right now, and in our opinion, it would be an appropriate place to consider future employment use.
Thank you, Eric. Councillor Coleman, you're next, please.
Hey, Mr. Mayor, and to the delegate, to Eric. I know it's adjacent to employment lands, but I also know it's directly across from a residential area in the city of Brantford. So how do you propose to get around that? Because we all know that putting industrial, commercial next to residential doesn't always agree.
Right. Well, you know, in terms of the residential land across County Road 18 from the property, you know, through the detailed development and zoning, you know, County Road 18 is a well-traveled road, and so we probably put more, you know, prestige uses or office uses against that frontage, and you know, some heavier stuff if need be can be further behind. And through the detailed development applications, you know, obviously land use compatibility, design considerations, and all those types of things would be considered. So, you know, what we're contemplating looking at this is that you'd have some more attractive things and less, you know, less potential impact users along the interface where there's any residential, and you know, sort of interior, you would have, you know, potentially some heavier warehousing or anything like that. But through the detailed development applications, obviously land use compatibility would have to be looked at and considered as part of the review process for development applications and zoning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Coleman. Are there any other questions of the presenter? Seeing none, thank you, Eric, for coming. Sorry, I butchered your name.
That's no problem.
How would you like to deal with this delegation? Motion to receive, Councillor Coleman, seconded by Councillor Wheat. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Thank you. Stay safe, stay well.
Thank you.
Moving on to 4.3, please. David Aston.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. I think I'm going to try and figure out how to share my screen here, but I've had bad luck every time I've tried this.
Nope.
Can you
got
see
it.
that okay tonight?
You got it right.
All right, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak. I first just want to start off by acknowledging the huge amount of work that county staff, Jennifer Boyer, and your consultants have done to come forward tonight with the report and presentation that you're about to receive. I know we have been involved in these types of projects for many years, and they take a lot of effort, and there's a lot of discussion and work that happens to get to this point. So, and Jennifer's been great. She's been always willing to talk to us and providing timely responses to questions that we have. So I wanted to start there and appreciate that. The next thing I wanted to just talk about is in reviewing the report, wanted to share some general comments before we got into specific requests of our client, TCA. And in general, I wanted to share support on the conclusion for the settlement boundary expansions. And I believe this is important for the future of the county. And it's important to consider the long-term protection of what I'm calling the corridor, which would be the Rest Acres Road and Highway 403 area, and making sure that that remains available for future investment opportunities. We also saw in the staff report the county request for the provincially significant employment zone at 403 and Rest Acres Road, and we support that approach. I know that's something that continues to be in process, but just wanted to share that that approach that staff have proposed is important for the future of these priority employment lands. And also in the report, there's a staff recommendation with regard to the potential to consider additional expansion beyond the land needs that are identified for additional employment lands to 2051 planning horizon and beyond. And I think that's very important and critical for council to consider. And just for a few points here, as you are aware, in your community, the land demand and need is expanding rapidly, given the demand for larger parcels and just the demand for land. As you know, the province overall is projecting population and growth to the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Now you're in the outer ring of the Greater Golden Horseshoe, but the amount of jobs that are being projected into the Greater Golden Horseshoe and the land availability in the Greater Golden Horseshoe is not seeming to match up. And the lack of supply in the Greater Golden Horseshoe and the demand for that land is just resulting in employers and jobs having to look outside of the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And the 403 and Rest Acres Road in County of Brant is really a great opportunity. And you're seeing it now with the investment in your community for jobs to locate in Brant County. The other thing that providing additional land can do is it can assist you to really provide that range and choice of suitable sites for employment uses to support a wide range of economic activities and ensuring market-ready sites. Another thing that I want to point out is when you're looking at land area, all of the land that you're looking at is going to need to be municipally serviced. Certainly the Rest Acres Road and 403 area, or your priority employment area that you're calling it, is looking to be serviced. And when making investment in infrastructure, it should be utilized most efficiently and effectively over the long term. So all lands that can be serviced should be considered within that boundary area so that that infrastructure that you're paying for is utilized to its greatest extent. And the long-term designation is important to maintain the county's supply for a competitive advantage and long-term economic prosperity. And this is, again, there's an opportunity for the county to capitalize on investment and demand. If you don't have the land available, the investment and the jobs will continue down the 403. So I think now it's critically important to be thinking of the needs now and the needs into the future. With regard to the TCA lands, there's a number of requests. I won't get into them in too much detail. I know the report's being received for information and there's additional discussions to occur. But there were 4 requests, 2 expansions, 3 expansions to the area, a conversion of land up in the Sharp Road area, and a request to identify land as part of a site-specific policy area, which I'll explain in a minute. The site-specific policy area in the official plan is lands that have been identified to be considered for future employment upon the completion of the aggregate resource operation. That's a summary of the policies and what they mean. So these lands that are identified here are part of that site-specific policy area, and we're requesting that these lands be identified as employment and brought into the urban boundary. An interesting thing related to these lands is on the bottom right of the screen, you'll see the approved aggregate operation plan. There's approval under this plan for a tunnel under the 403, if you can see my hand approximately in that area, and for an access road under the 403 as well. And so there's opportunity here to provide connections for both servicing and potentially vehicular under the 403 and to the other industrial lands on the east side of Rest Acres Road. We call these the Biederman lands. These are lands directly adjacent to the existing industrial area, proposed 40-hectare adjustment. We believe they're a logical extension of the urban area. Servicing for these lands would go to the east and all be captured within the existing catchment area for the stormwater management through the county employment lands and the sanitary pumping station that's being considered in the planning stages of adjacent lands just to the other side of Rest Acres Road. In Sharp Road lands, there's an employment conversion request. TCA purchased these lands from the county a number of years ago. We're requesting that you can see in the hatched yellow, this portion of the land be converted for residential. As you can see, the yellow is planned residential directly adjacent to it and commercial up along Dundas Street. The plan is to retain some lands for employment use, but to convert this portion, given that it's quite fragmented with the environmental area, and we're looking to try and minimize compatibility issues with the planned residential uses there. And just to point out, these lands are not part of that priority employment in 403 and Rest Acres, obviously. And that's a consideration and discussion we've been having with staff. In conclusion, it would be our request that the submissions of TCA be endorsed by the county to support the objective of providing employment land for short and long-term objectives. And we know that this evening is a report being considered and is part of the completion of the municipal comprehensive review for the official plan. And so we look forward to working with county staff moving forward. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind words in regard to our staff. We think they do a great job, and it's nice to hear it from people like you, because I know they work hard all day. Are there any questions to the presenter? And Councillor Miller first, please.
Just one quick question, Mr. Mayor, through you to Mr. Ast. Those parcels you're looking at, they're not all they're not all the same owner, are they?
Through Mr. Mayor, yes, they are all the same owner, TCA.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. No, I appreciate. It looks like you give it some thought, anyways, on each of those parcels. I appreciate that.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, those site-specific policy areas have been in the county official plan for some time. And between myself and Greg Sweetenham, who I know is watching this evening, and one of my former partners, Bernie Hermson, we've been giving planning consideration to employment in the county of Brant for a couple of decades. So now's the time that we're seeing some of the opportunity to really move forward with.
Thank you. Councillor Chambers, you're next, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to David. I'm wondering if you would comment and put your planner hat on for a few minutes and talk about aggregate lands being completed as aggregate producing lands and converted to employment lands in both long-term and short-term designation requests, and the philosophies of doing one or the other or both.
Yeah, through your worship, Councilor Chambers, it's a good question, and it's something we've been talking about with county staff as you're looking at the land budget and timing associated with expansions. And there's opportunity to rehabilitate the operations to employment uses, and consideration to do so. There's a number of factors, and I talked about servicing and considerations associated with how do the lands get serviced based on the aggregate operation that has occurred. And so that's part of the thinking, and that's been part of the consideration for many years, ensuring that there's opportunity for those lands to be serviced. With regard to the use, we are currently just about, a portion of the plan is registered and another portion very soon at Hardy Road and 403 with TCA. There's a former aggregate operation there that is now, the grading's been completed and serviced, and there's over 100 acres for sure of aggregate lands that have been rehabilitated for employment and industrial purposes. Part of those lands would be the Hershey's operation as an example. So we're confident that it's a compatible reuse of the aggregate operation, and we'll continue to have discussions with staff on what the timing looks like as far as potential to bring those lands on, because as I said, I think it's important that all of the lands that are potentially being considered for expansion at the Rest Acres and 403 Road be considered to come on over the long term. And we'll, like I said, we'll work with staff to understand the timing a little bit more.
Thank you. Councillor Bell, you're first, please. Then Councillor Gatward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Dave. Dave, question on the sharp lands. Can you again help me understand this? We just determined at the last meeting of this committee that we had 395 hectares surplus residential land within the Paris and St. George area. And now you're proposing to add to that. At the same time, we are short apparently of industrial land. Help me understand that, please.
Yeah, sure. Through your worship to Councillor Bell. Again, another good question. We've had a lot of discussion with county staff on this request. This request has really been in the works, again, for at least 5 years, where since the time that TCA purchased the lands from the county. in our opinion, these lands are not priority employment lands. In fact, they're probably unfavorable for any key industrial and employment type uses, given the proximity to the planned commercial uses and the real lack of transportation connections. Again, this employment area is at the very end of Sharp Road, and really there would be no connection to Dundas Street, as you're all aware. Access to Dundas Street is a challenge in that area, given the train bridge and other connections there. So we really see this location as not a prime employment area. We've been having discussions with staff on if it's not residential, what else could go there. At the time of our request, if you could appreciate, our request goes in before those reports come out, and staff have been very good at talking with us about the reports and that point that you raised. So we believe that there's opportunity there for a different type of use or mixed use or some residential, but at the same time, we also believe that it's not going to develop as an employment area over the longer term.
Thank you, Dave.
Councillor Gatwood, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Dave. My question is also regarding the Sharp Road lands. And you've already mentioned that the county sold that to TCA. And I recall very clearly at the time, the county had already done a development plan for those lands through KMK. And it was a dead end when you bought it. And I think, have they mined the gravel out of that site? Can you tell us that?
Through your worship, yes. The gravel has been completed out of that Sharp Road portion.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Dave? Seeing none, thank you for coming tonight, Dave.
Thank you.
And I would looking for a motion to receive, please. Councillor Pierce, seconded by Councillor Bell. There's no other questions or concerns. All those in favor, consider it received. Thank you very much. Stay safe. 404 or 4.4, Douglas Stewart and Bob Stewart from Pinevest. Who's going to be speaking? Hello, Bob.
I do believe it'll be me that'll be speaking.
Thank you.
I believe staff are going to bring up our presentation. I would appreciate that.
Thank you.
So to the mayor and council and special guests, I'm here on behalf of the IBBI group and representing Pinevest Homes. I'm here to speak to a piece of property owned by Pinevest called 67 Woodsley Avenue in Paris. If I could change the slide, please. I would like to say that the intent of the official plan review is to look at from all of the historic land use designations and to evaluate, are there better locations and what is the evaluation of those from the employment land perspective. What you will see in the report from your consultant and staff, that's the basic principle. We do concur with the conversion evaluation criteria which is again in the report on page 28 of the PDF and 29 of the report. You do need to look at the provincial policy statement. You do need to look at the growth plan. You do need to look at whether there are other existing and proposed employment lands that may be more appropriate. You should evaluate, is there justification and is there a good planning rationale? I'm here to speak on behalf of 67 Woodsley and the conversion from employment to urban residential. Could we have the next slide, please? Just a bit of background. When you look at 67 Woodsley, it's a small part of a bigger area that was part of a special area study that the council of the day approved in 2012. It provides for a mix of residential, provides for some lands for employment, as well as the protection of the natural environment. It would be our opinion that this parcel of land is more part of a residential area that has built and under construction, and therefore we're looking at what the best use of that land could be. Into the next slide. We have had meetings with staff, which we appreciate. We had a formal pre-submission meeting on April 1st. We have since that meeting revised our plan based on feedback we received from staff. The intent of the applications, which would involve an official plan amendment, a draft plan of subdivision, and an amendment to the zoning bylaw to implement that, would be to take 5% of the land area and add that to the existing park. The staff of the county advised that with this additional lands for park, that park becomes a key part of the area for residential. We're proposing residential along the interface of Hartley Avenue to provide a transition between what is there existing and what will be proposed along with the Woodsley Avenue portion. On Woodsley Avenue, we have had a variety of concepts which we're still working through, which will provide for a mix of residential with some ground floor commercial, ground floor office to provide employment, and it provides a good streetscape and interface along Woodsley. We're in discussions because we truly believe that there is a need for affordable housing, and we're looking to provide a parcel of the land so that that can be under consideration as an affordable aspect of the housing. There will be a mix, as I suggested, of multi-story commercial ground and some residential above along Woodsley, some stacked towns perhaps, and a mixture of other towns, all with the intent of providing a mix of form of housing, provide an affordable aspect, and to provide for employment. If we could have the next slide, please. So what's the next step? It's up to us. We need to create the concept, address the feedback we had from staff on what a formal application would consist of. We're certainly requesting council give consideration to accepting the conversion and providing for a mixed use of residential on this on these parcels of land. From our perspective, if you go back, should it remain employment lands? When you look at your evaluation criteria, it's our opinion it should not retain the employment land designation. There are much better areas where that can be certainly accomplished, and we think this infill, project would support the long-term needs of the county. And this concludes our presentation, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Douglas.
Welcome.
There are questions, certainly. Councillor Howe is your first, then Councillor Gatward, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to the delegation. So you always catch my attention when I see the words affordable housing. And I wanted to probe into that a little further, recognizing that these are early stage discussions. But are we to visualize, and I understood you said some commercial and office space on the ground floor and then residential above. Are we to visualize a rentals situation, or are we to visualize condos? And is it truly affordable, not attainable housing by definition? Just wanted to clarify that, please.
If I may reply back through the mayor, and I would ask also on this presentation is Mr. Stewart from Pinefest. It is our intent to provide a portion of this property to in an arrangement of either as a joint venture or a partnership, that an affordable housing group, and there are a number out there, are always trying to look for property when we think this is a great location from a land use perspective. Partly what I will conclude with is there will be detached housing, there will be street fronting townhouses, there will be apartments above the mixed land use to support a continuum of housing. Is it attainable? Is it affordable? That's something we're striving for, but I will now turn it over to Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Douglas, and through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor House. Thanks for the question. And yeah, definitely, as Douglas had stated, we are going for the actual affordable housing with that partnership as per the definition with CMHC. And again, we are looking at some various partners to do that with. I think you'd all know the area quite well. The way we would block out the plan on a more detailed concept, which we have some other detailed concepts, but obviously that's evolving through our conversations with staff, would be to have a piece dedicated to that affordable housing on its own, as well as look at the potential and or for above the commercial lands for apartments or condos, maybe a portion of the through CMHC, you could do a portion of those apartments as affordable, and then condominiumize some of the others. So there's definitely a lot of options there we're exploring, but when we do say affordable, we mean the affordable side of it.
Thank you.
If I may add one other comment, and it was a discussion with staff. Staff have indicated that over time there are numerous funding programs out there. Unfortunately, the one for now has been consumed. It's certainly something we will keep in mind when future funding programs are announced, which we expect.
Thank you. Councillor Gatward?
Thank you, Mayor Bailey. My question is also regarding the affordable housing piece. Do you have a plan for a number of units, and have you had any discussions with the housing department in the city?
If I may reply through the mayor, and I'll ask Bob to speak as well. We did prepare a concept that had stacked townhouses that was somewhat designed after some other affordable housing projects by a number of groups. We met with staff with our proposal. Staff came back with a number of suggestions. It's more so a matter of we've not had sufficient amount of time to reevaluate that, but there were 26, I believe, stacked townhouses or around that number. And we're certainly going to bring that back. We just have not had a chance to prepare that concept.
Yes, and just to follow up on that, if I may, we are looking at those stacked towns as well as potentially removing those stacked towns for a potential building. We have been in talk, and Indwell did a great presentation as part of the development information session. So we were speaking with them, and we are closely following what the county is now doing on High Street in St. George with that building. And speaking with Indwell, we're definitely discussing that sweet spot for the unit count for them to actually make it work. Sometimes it's in that 40 to 50 range. It could be 60, but again, we're definitely exploring that, and that will be part of some future information as we develop those concepts.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? No, seeing none, thank you for coming and speaking to us tonight. You better promise to do that, Bob. And
I think this is recorded.
We want you to sign something, I think.
No problem.
Anyway, thank you very much. And if there's no other questions, I'm looking for a motion to receive his information, please. Councillor Howe, seconded by Councillor Coleman. There's no other conversation. All those in favor to receive. Thank you. Stay well and stay safe.
Thank you. You as well.
Yeah. 4.5, please. And we're going to hear from Ella Haley. I know she's here because I saw her picture.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you, Ella.
Okay. I think Adam has to open up the camera.
Okay. Welcome, Ella.
Okay, this one there. Okay.
There you go.
Good evening. Thank you for hearing my delegation tonight. We've just finished the Greenbelt consultation. The deadline for letters was on, I believe, Monday or Tuesday, and all kinds of groups across the province, especially Southern Ontario, were arguing that we need the Greenbelt to stop exactly what's happening tonight, these requests to gobble up more farmland. So we've just finished that and sent in all kinds of requests for that. But I wanted to quote from the OFA. I'm a member of the National Farmers Union. But you've got several members on council who are members of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. And I have a great respect for your president, Peggy Breckveld. And so she's just written, as of Monday, she's written about the gobbling up basically of farmland and how many farms we lose. I believe we lose 175 acres a day. We lose 5 farms a week. And this is just not sustainable. And we're seeing how it happens tonight with people asking for this bit of farmland and that bit of farmland. And no one's really talking about the farmland. Agriculture is a major employer in Brant County, but it seems to be left out of this conversation. We hear about economic development. We hear about trying to have land converted to employment lands, but agriculture is an employer. It's a big employer in Brant County. Adam, if you could go to the first slide, or the next one. Okay. So if you see the map there, it's one of your maps. It's basically the settlement area boundary expansion request for the Paris area. And that's 345 gross hectares. That's 852 acres of land. That's an awful lot of farmland that's being requested there. We're asking for firm, even the OFA is very strong in saying no boundary expansions, strict, firm boundaries, urban settlement boundaries. So then if you go to the Cainesville map, Adam, the next map. Okay, you've got there, thank you. So with the Cainesville map, you've got 93 hectares of land there. And that's 230 acres. So that's Sobara. It's mainly Sobara's land and his colleague. And Then you've also got the Papal land where they're asking, no, sorry, I stand corrected. The Papal land, they're asking for that to be put within the urban settlement boundary. And that's a huge farm. First Urban tried to get it converted from agriculture to development in the one of the OPs, maybe the last one or maybe the one before that, and it failed. And so now it's coming back to council. The Papal farm is basically one of the best farms in Brant County. It's a very successful farm. And when I hear the advocate for the conversion, for the consultant there is saying that this is class 4 land, this is an excellent farm. And so we need to protect it. Then when we look at the conversion, that's the Sabara lands. That's in Cainesville, more on the south there. You'll see that they're arguing that it's not near the 403. It's very close to the 403. The Sabara lands are very easily accessed to the 403. So sorry, I don't buy that argument. And when they argue that it would be dirty industry, well, I just heard the Papal farm arguing that if we front along the residential along County Road 18, that we could have cleaner jobs there. So I think the Sabara land could very easily have cleaner jobs if they are near a residential area. And besides, let's be more environmental. Let's have cleaner jobs anyways. You're seeing the very same game in Paris going on when you have requests to convert employment lands to residential lands. And I ask you, if you go back to the last OP or the one before that, what was the argument they made to have the urban boundary extended? Was it that they were arguing for employment lands? I've watched it over the years. You'll see the argument, we need employment lands, we need employment lands. And then you'll see in the next OP, they say, oh, could we convert it to residential? So I'm a bit leery of these requests. I went through the entire report, and when I looked at the Watson report, if you look at, say, page 96, 97, you keep seeing this concern about fragmenting employment land, about putting it at risk, about making sure that you support it. But you could say the exact same thing for agriculture. You don't see agriculture anywhere in there, but we need to have Watson saying the very same thing. You know, there's a concern about fragmenting agricultural land. If we eat up the Papal farm, then you've got the next farm right next to it. And will they say, well, the Papal farm is industrial, so we convert it? So I'm just really concerned. We're just gobbling up. It just seems to be each OP, there's more and more requests to convert land and to extend the urban settlement boundary. I just wanted to quote from Kevin Eby. He's a planner in Waterloo, and he is raising concerns about the growth forecasts. He argues that there's different forecasts and that the provincial growth forecasts don't add up. He said it's more reliable to look at the Ministry of Finance forecasts. And his concern is that if we overestimate growth, then we end up having a shortfall in development charges. And he's just really concerned. He states it over and over that the growth predictions are often way off the actual growth rate. So I just wanted to caution councillors on that. Another thing too is if we look at our density, and if we look at page 42, maybe the planners can help clarify this for me. It says that the density is 15 jobs per hectare, 15 jobs for 2.5 acres. That's a lot of land for 15 jobs. And so what you've got is a request. Sorry, just one moment here. No. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No. Okay. So what you've got in other communities is you have people trying to plan for public transit, and you're trying to provide public transit in employment lands. And so they're going as high as 80 jobs per hectare. And on page 42, I see that we're at 15. That's not good enough. If we want to protect farmland and if we want public transit, and if council, you voted to support efforts to address climate change, then we need to increase that density and intensification. The Greenbelt does not allow agriculture conversions, and so that's why we really want it in this area. Outside of the Greenbelt, you see very high conversion rates. You see major reductions in density and intensification. In between 2006 and 2011, the outer ring of the Greater Golden Horseshoe lost 2 times as much farmland as the inner. We're in that outer ring. So I just wanted to raise a few questions as I end up here. We need to question this practice of requesting boundary settlement expansions for employment land, and then in a subsequent OP, seeing the same land and seeing a request from employment land to residential. We need to question the growth forecasts because they don't measure up and will end up being out of pocket for development charges. We need to increase the density and increase the intensification so that we can address climate change, so that we can provide public transit. I was out at the hotel out at Oak Park Road on a really cold, windy day, and I saw people waiting for a bus. And you know, the bus comes very rarely to that area. And they were just so cold standing there. They don't have a chance to have a, you know, a really good bus schedule because it's so isolated and such low density. We need to factor in COVID. COVID's changing everything. A lot of businesses are going out of business. You've got tremendous debt at the federal level, the provincial level, and at the personal level. So things aren't going to be things aren't going to be the same after COVID. We need to address climate change by, again, trying to have more public transit, less sprawl. And we need to protect farmland so that we can grow our own food, so that we have food sovereignty and food security. And so I come back to the efforts that we made, all kinds of groups this last week, making a request to expand the Greenbelt to make sure that it includes the Grand River watershed, that it includes Brant County, that we protect the agricultural system, our natural heritage system, and our water sources.
Ms. Haley, you have 1 minute remaining.
Okay. And these suggestions will help us to stop sprawl in Brant County. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella.
Thank you.
Are there any questions for Ella? Can we get that screen to disappear for us, the split screen, please? Thank you. Are there any Councillor Miller first, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Ella. Ella, I believe the plan after tonight is each of those requests will be looked at and by planning staff and brought maybe to planning committee, and anyways, each of them will be based on their own merits. I think that's my understanding. And you made very clear you don't want to see the settlement areas expanded. Would you be supportive of, say, if we did expand in one area because it might make sense, because it might be a piece of land close to 403, so it reduces truck traffic? Would you be supportive if we expanded it there, but at the same time we removed employment lands elsewhere and reverted it back to agriculture, hectare for hectare?
Is that on the table?
We've done it before, right? We've done it before. The province actually asked us to do that. So I just wonder if that's something that you could support.
I guess I would like to not see any ag land lost, any more ag land lost. I'd love to see more regained. I guess I'd need to see that example, but I guess I'd like to go back to finding out more about this density, this 15 jobs per hectare. That's really alarming. So that if you can increase the density and intensification, you don't need more land for employment if you have more compact employers, more compact towns.
I'll email you an example. And when I say you support it, I do mean you personally, but I also know that there are a lot of like-minded people such as yourself. So we want people to be happy, and we want it to make sense. So that's why I thought I'd run that by you. But I'll email you the example, and we can discuss it later.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, you're next, please.
Thank you, Mayor Bailey. And through you to Ella. Ella, thank you for your presentation. I think it's really good to have a lot of different balance. And I know, developers are going to be really interested in development, but I think the community is very interested as well. And I think you represent a lot of the voices that have talked to you. And I really thank you for bringing the NFU up as well. That's an important voice as well. My question would be similar to Councillor Miller's, but a little different. You seem to be focusing on the saving of farmland, which I know is a very passionate issue for you and many. Now, when we look at the presentation about Woodsley Ave, where there's employment land, and looking at a mix where there'd still be employment there with the bottom floors, et cetera. Are you speaking to that as well with the same sort of passion and vigor, or are you more focused on the saving of hectares of farmland?
I don't know that case that well. I do know that some people in the province have been very, very upset where they've seen the ministerial zoning orders put in under the guise of affordable housing. And so I worry about that affordable housing, catchphrase to win an application. I worry about that. I need to know a whole lot more about the actual case.
Okay, and I guess my other question would be, when it comes to other farmers, in the general community, I know there's a lot of split around Greenbelt, and there's going to be some split around this. But for the farmers who are farming, who have plans for farming in the future, and I guess the NFU, when you talk about that gobbling up piece, what are some other things a council like ours can do to prevent some of that gobbling?
Well, you see, if you bring in the Greenbelt, it stops that speculation of land. As soon as they created the Greenbelt, and that was a political decision at the Brant-Hamilton line to stop it, then we had Walton come in and buy 5,000 acres of land. We had First Urban come in. We had we had Sobara, we had Hopewell, we had all kinds of people jump into Brant County because we were just outside of the Greenbelt. So that's what we're dealing with. There's a lot of money to be made right now. And money, I think, is a key factor behind all this. So we need that protection. We need that Greenbelt. And we need council to be very strict about strict urban boundary. No boundary expansion.
Okay, so just one last follow-up, if I can, Mr. Mayor. So the Greenbelt piece ultimately will be decided by the province, and we've consulted with them, and it's been a mix. But is there anything else from the planning side of things on the municipal side that you'd suggest as well? Just if you had to, is there one other thing that we should be keeping in mind around best practices for retaining farmland?
We've got local land trusts. The problem with land trusts, and we did form Langford Conservancy, it's a land trust, but the problem with land trusts, it's on an individual basis. So willing farm owner protects their land. And so that's piecemeal. So that's a good practice, but it's piecemeal. So we sometimes you'll see, I think we just need a whole lot of support for agriculture in Brant County as well, and for small farmers, not just the larger farmers, for the small farmers, so that you have local food. A lot of your food that's grown here gets shipped out, shipped to other countries. So we need to support that local food economy, especially during COVID.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Ella? Seeing none, Ella, I hope you don't think this council doesn't have its eye on farming. I don't know what you think or what you believe, but I'm very aware, and I think this council is very aware of how important farming is to the county of Brant, and how proud we all are that we are in this position. So I hope you can sleep a little bit better tonight, knowing that you have support.
Thank you.
Many more places than you might think. So thank you for coming to speak to us tonight. I'm looking for a motion to accept Ella's presentation, please, as information. Councillor Howes, please, and then Councillor Laferriere. There's no other discussion. All those in favor to receive. Thank you, Alice. Stay well, stay safe. Thank you. And now on to Jennifer for the main performance of the evening. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you very much, Mayor Bailey, and thank you very much, members of council, for having us tonight. And I appreciate and thank all the delegations tonight. I talked to them all before the meeting, and they're very good providing all the information on time. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. Alrighty, everyone can see that?
Yep, thank you.
All right, good. So we do have another presentation. I know the time's going to get on tonight, and we'd be happy to answer questions after the presentation, before the report recommendation. So on behalf of myself and General Manager Pam Dusling from Development Services, myself, Jamie Cook from Watson and Associates and Brad Post will be doing the presentation tonight. And as I said, happy to answer questions after. And before we move on, I have a special thanks to General Manager Allison Newton and her staff, Russ Press, Zach Gable, Brandon Webb. They've been an integral part of the employment land needs analysis from 2017, if you can believe, when it started. So thank you very much to Allison and her team for this tonight. So basically the purpose of this presentation right now is to follow up from where we were. If you can believe it, it's already March 2nd. It's already at the end of April. The community area land needs assessment, which is our residential land needs we talked about. And as mentioned tonight, there's already been a lot of discussion about those needs. Tonight we're focusing on the employment piece of the land needs assessment, part of our municipal comprehensive review. And there's a lot of facets, because if you remember way back when, I also was asked by council to bring some digestible pieces. And this is actually as digestible as we could get tonight in terms of employment, because there's still a lot of information coming in terms of market analysis, commercial and retail, even, you know, the price per hectare, rural land needs as well. So this is really focusing on where we're at in terms of the official plan review and those needs associated with the growth plan tonight. So we're going to review those land needs tonight. And also you've heard about the conversion requests we've received and the settlement area boundary expansion requests for all employment actually. No residential expansions except for just one or two that are going to be coming up to you later. But really, we've got a lot of work to do ahead of us. And I just want to say in terms of those requests, and I appreciate the comments from our delegations, is that we've worked hard with them. And it's not like we had solicited a lot of them, but we put criteria and due dates for people to ensure that they submit on time so we could have a thorough review. So where are we at in the actual process and the timeline? Like, why are we here today in terms of the OP? We've accomplished actually quite a lot already, but there's still a lot of work to do in terms of our official plan with not a lot of time. But you can see in terms of the steps of the work plan about this flow chart about where we're at. And you can see in the red line, the employment land needs fitting into the municipal comprehensive review and also the land needs assessment. So all this is forming our policy directions, which I'll come to you again probably at the beginning of June about where we're taking the official plan. So some of the information tonight that you've heard is, you know, will we expand our settlement area boundary? Will we ask for conversion requests? Will these be allowed? How much land do we need? Are we going to need more? Are we going to do different things about excess land? So those are some of the policy directions we're working on that will be seeking your advice and direction. So, and obviously we have a new official plan coming. Our draft will be to you hopefully by the end of July. So we can get it in terms of growth plan conformity to the province for 2022. So as already talked about, this presentation is really focusing on employment area demand and land requirements. We are looking at our vacant land inventory that's been going on for quite some time. And then also looking at those requests that we've received from landowners and what to do with them. So, and as I've mentioned, this is part of our municipal comprehensive review. You know, we've got quite a lot of facets, and I know there's been some comments tonight about, you know, where rural land's sitting in terms of this, and also, you know, where certain areas are classified, like Cainesville came up in terms of what is it rural, is it urban? And I just want to caveat to say that, you know, we're updating really what it comes down to a 2008 official plan. It's very much out of date. The Municipal Comprehensive Review was done in 2008, and there's two growth plans in between that. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of like where the allocations will go. And the province has given us fairly prescriptive guidelines, but as an outer ring municipality, it's not easy for us because we do have a lot of rural lands. And we have to really look at tonight about, you know, in terms of our need, how we service them, do we service these lands? And I'm sure you're aware that we've already had an uptake of quite a bit of employment lands in the 403 corridor in the last few weeks, which has taken out some lands out of the inventory already. These big projects that you've heard about. So this is a work in progress, and I'll turn it over now to Jamie Cook, who's going to lead us through the presentation. And as I said, staff are available for questions after. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council and staff. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you again tonight on this really important subject on the employment land strategy. So I'm going to walk through about, with Brad, my colleague, probably about a half an hour at most, hopefully, presentation. As Jen mentioned, we've got a lot of material in here. We've tried to keep it pretty high level, but we want to make sure we provide enough details to make sure that that all the nuances are coming out. So just wanted to recap before we get into the employment land needs analysis, where we were last time we spoke, which was on the community area land needs. And if we go to the next slide, as we mentioned in the last presentation, when we went through that analysis, we determined at the end of that process that ultimately the county by 2051 has a surplus of urban community area. So that's the areas where we're going to be accommodating most of the living area, including residential and mixed use and other commercial type uses, but not where the industrial uses are going to go. Overall, there's a surplus of 395 gross hectares when we compare supply versus demand. So that's the first thing we just wanted to just remind everybody about where we landed in the last session with council. And then if we go to the next slide. Also want to just provide a bit of an overview on the overall hierarchy of land within the county and how that relates to the land needs assessment. So last time when we were speaking to this issue, we were speaking largely about the, again, those community area lands, those areas in yellow. And we've been specifically focusing on the areas in urban settlement areas, specifically the area of Paris, urban area, and St. George. Tonight, we're looking at the employment areas. So we're looking at the areas that are designated here in blue and other areas within the county that are designated blue as employment. Now, it's really important for us to remember that there's urban employment areas and there's rural employment areas. And when we look at the LNA really focuses on the urban system. Its focus is really looking at urban land requirements for community area and employment area. And it does frankly make things kind of confusing for a place like Brant County when you have so much urban and rural land to work with. And it's important that we don't lose sight of the importance of the rural area. Clearly, as we've heard tonight, the rural area is a very significant component of the economy. It has a role to play, very much so in terms of economic development, accommodating people and jobs, and it also needs to be looked at. But the LNA doesn't require us to do a detailed assessment like we're doing for the urban lands when we're looking at rural. So it is important to keep that in mind. And it's also important to keep in mind that we're categorizing certain areas as urban employment and some areas as rural. So for the purposes of our work, all the lands that are within the Paris urban area, including the Paris 403 Business Park, plus St. George, are considered to be urban employment areas. All the other lands that are designated blue outside of those areas are considered to be rural employment areas. Those are areas that are right now outside of settlement areas for the most part and are not serviced. So I just want to keep that definition in mind as we're going through this. Next slide. So we provided a lot of background on the overall outlook for the economy more regionally and how those regional influences are impacting growth within Brant. We talked a lot about those growth pressures back in December when I spoke to you. And so we're not going to go into those details again today, but I just did want to highlight a couple things before we get into the nuts and bolts of the supply and demand. Sorry, we're going to slide, I think my slide deck feels a little out of order, but okay, first of all, before we get to that, no, it's okay, we'll go to the next slide. I had a different slide for, sorry, just lost my my flow a bit. But first of all, when we look at how, just building on that urban structure, when we look at the breakdown and hierarchy of employment areas, again, we have employment all over the county, in community areas and in employment areas, in urban areas and in rural areas. So in those yellow areas, in the community areas, that's where we accommodate most of our retail and personal service type uses, as well as institutional uses. Those are uses that generally follow population growth and are generally accommodated within proximity to residential development, or in your downtown nodes and along certain nodes, in certain nodes and corridors. Then we have the urban employment areas. Here you can see on the right, which are where we're accommodating our urban type industrial type development, also including other commercial and employment supportive uses. Then we have the rural employment areas, which are areas that are accommodating industrial type developments outside of the urban areas, typically on areas that are not serviced by municipal services. And then lastly, we have other rural employment. That's rural employment in agricultural areas, specifically farms and other employment supportive uses, typically to the agricultural sector. And that could also include things like resource extraction and primary resources other than farming, for example. Next slide. So why are employment lands important? Well, I mean, it's probably obvious to most of us here. They are important because they form a very vital component of the urban structure of the county. This is where we're going to be accommodating the majority of our industrial type jobs we have been and over the next several decades, where most of the industrial type jobs and commercial jobs, to some extent, will be located. And it's important to recognize that most of these jobs are land extensive, and they need certain infrastructure and location requirements in terms of providing a competitive location where these types of businesses can be located. And so if you don't have the right urban structure to accommodate these lands, then you are going to have difficulties growing your industrial sector. And when we're talking about your industrial sector, we're talking primarily about your export-based sectors. And these are the kind of sectors that are required to ensure that your economy continues to grow. You can still grow with employment outside of export sectors, but those export sectors like manufacturing and construction, utilities, transportation, and other technology-driven sectors in the office market are all very important sectors in growing the overall economy. They provide balance to your assessment base. They provide job opportunities. They provide opportunities for a live-work relationship, or a better ratio, release dependency on commuting. They have economic implications in terms of indirect and direct or induced employment effects. And they create net positive fiscal benefits. So for all these reasons, it's important that we look at these lands. And it's also important not to just look at the need and the quantity, but also the quality of these lands and the market readiness of these lands. So these are other themes that we'll be talking about tonight when we're looking at employment lands. Next slide. So we talked quite a bit last time when I was here about the overall drivers of employment growth on employment lands within Brant County. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail tonight, but a few points just to highlight again is that when we talked last time, we did note that there is a fairly large concentration of manufacturing uses, construction, transportation, wholesale trade types of uses within Brant County. We saw clusters of those uses when we looked at them relative to the province. We also know that the supply of industrial land is diminishing in the GTA, particularly in the West GTA, in places like Peel and specifically places like Brampton. And it's also starting to diminish in other large urban centers across the GTA, more specifically in that west side. And so that is creating more outward growth pressure for businesses to be looking further out, in the greater Golden Horseshoe and even beyond that area into further along down the 401 corridor into places like Woodstock, for example. The prices of land are quite a bit more affordable or more competitive in this area of the greater Golden Horseshoe. While they are increasing relative to the GGH, they're quite a bit more affordable, which also creates opportunities for greater feasibility for land extensive developments. You also have the 403 corridor, obviously, which is a key driver and infrastructure asset that's driving development in this area. And so when we look at activity, there's considerable amount of activity in the pipeline right now. There's about 2 million square feet of new builds or expansions that are currently being looked at. There's also about 1 million square feet of speculative development that's also currently under review within the county, which starts to show that the overall market is gaining strength overall in the county, and we expect that will continue going forward. Next slide. So also just wanted to also further reiterate the importance of the structural changes in the economy that have been occurring over the last several decades. And this isn't really a new thing, but it's important to recognize that over the past several decades, there has been a shift away from a lot of the traditional industrial sectors in Ontario and more broadly in North America towards more knowledge-based sectors such as advanced manufacturing, clean tech, professional scientific services, for example. So it's important also to recognize these shifts that are occurring in the market when we're looking at how we're planning for employment lands moving forward. This really emphasizes the importance of placemaking when it comes to looking at how we plan for employment areas, considering innovative design, and also policies that foster clusters of innovation and connectivity with businesses, and also ensuring there's a range of other employment supportive uses within these employment areas. They're going to not only attract businesses, but are also going to attract labor and people wanting to come to work in these areas. So another important policy direction that we'll be looking at as we move forward with the strategy. So I'm going to turn over to Brad. He's going to go through the supply, and then we're going to get back into the land needs analysis.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. So the next few slides provide an overview of the employment area land supply. So basically, the employment area land supply has been classified into two broad categories: urban employment areas, which include Paris and St. George, and rural employment areas, the county's remaining employment areas. Identifying the employment area land needs is prepared for the urban employment areas in accordance with the growth plan and the provincial land needs methodology. Having said that, we have allocated growth to rural employment areas and will provide further details on rural employment areas in the report. It's important to note that the employment growth allocation and land needs consider the constraints of servicing in St. George. Next slide, please. This slide here provides a summary of what's included in the employment area land supply and what's excluded. So the table on the left is what's included, and the table on the right is excluded. I do know that there is a typo on the table on the right. It is indeed what's excluded. So in terms of with respect to what's included, the table on the left, the supply includes all lands designated in the OP as employment. The growth plan and the provincial land needs methodology requires us to summarize the supply on a gross land basis. And this includes the parcels designated employment in the OP and internal roads and internal infrastructure, such as stormwater ponds. As previously noted, in accordance with the growth plan and the land needs methodology, we are required to utilize the urban employment area lands in the land needs analysis. With respect to what's excluded, the table on the right, basically we take out the environmental features, major arterial roads, railways, highways that run through the employment areas. The provincial land needs methodology allows us to consider adjustments to the vacant land supply, and this would include potential constraints where these sites may not be deemed developable over the planning horizon. So you'll notice in the supplemental mapping package, we have mapped out all the employment area land supply, and in that mapping, we have identified the sites that we have excluded from the supply. I'll just quickly summarize the two key areas that we have excluded from the supply. So there's 2 large tracts of land in St. George that are landlocked with no road access. That represents about 28 hectares. The second includes a large tract of land in Paris Southwest, near the railway lands and the Paris landfill site. And then these lands represent approximately 8 hectares. And due to the environmental features in this area, the ability for a sizable building lot is just not, there's just not much of a building lot, there's not that much of a buildable lot area because of all the environmental features that are present on those lands. Other adjustments were made to smaller sites in Cainesville and Burford West. It is important to note that these adjustments are different than the land vacancy adjustment, the land vacancy factor that we have used in the employment land needs analysis that Jamie will later explain in the presentation. So with respect to what is considered vacant, our inventory was carried out in the first half of 2020. The inventory was conducted based on a desktop review and was later reviewed by county staff. Vacant sites that had a building permit issued prior to mid-2020 are classified as developed. Any lands that had a building permit issued after mid-2020 are considered vacant. This slide here provides a quick summary of the designated employment area land supply in Brant County, and this includes both urban and rural. So approximately 55% of the employment area land supply is vacant, is developed, and 41% is vacant. We removed, as previously noted, we removed about 60 hectares of land from the inventory, and that represents about 4% of the total designated land area. In total, Brant County has about 1,500 gross hectares of designated employment lands, employment area lands. Next slide. This slide provides an overview of the vacant land supply by employment area. Approximately 56% of the supply is in the urban areas of Paris and St. George, and 44% is in the county's remaining rural employment areas. And again, details of the employment land supply is provided in the supplemental package. Next slide, please. The next series of slides provide a summary of the employment forecast that was previously presented in December. Next slide, please. So this slide here provides the forecast to 2051, and then we have shown here a breakdown of the employment by type. So the orange represents the rural, the light gray is population-related employment, and the dark gray is employment lands employment. So it's important to note that employment lands employment is basically employment in industrial type buildings. As we will later explain, employment areas are forecast to include some non-industrial uses, such as commercial and supportive uses to employment areas. Over the forecast, the county is anticipated to add 9,900 jobs over 2021 to 2051. Of that, 50% is employment lands employment, again, the industrial type employment. 44% is population-related employment, and 6% is rural. It's important to note that these allocations are based on employment type. Allocations by area type, such as employment areas, will be discussed later in the presentation, and will have different shares given that the employment areas include employment, lands employment, and population-related employment. Also included in this graph is the employment activity rate. The employment activity rate is the ratio of jobs to population. It is calculated by dividing the jobs over population. As of 2021, the activity rate in Brant is 40%. The activity rate has increased from 38% in 2001 to 40% in 2021. This indicates that the employment base is increasing at a faster rate than the population base. Over the next 30 years, we are forecasting an increase in the employment activity rate from 40% in 2021 to 44% in 2051. Next slide, please. Slide 20 provides the annual growth of the annual employment growth allocations to 2051 by urban area. And this again was presented previously back in December. It should be noted that, it should be noted that the annual growth rate here is based on 2006 to 2020 and then 2020 to 2051. As shown here, the annual rate of employment growth is anticipated to increase in pairs from 140 annually in 2016 to 2020 to over 240 to 260 over the longer term. St. George's employment area is anticipated to increase from 30 jobs annually over the 2016 to 2020 period to 50 to 60 jobs annually over the forecast horizon. Next slide, please. This slide provides the annual rate of employment growth. As shown here, Watson is forecasting an annual rate of employment growth of 1.6%, which is higher than the historical rate of growth. For comparison, over the 2006 to 2021 period, the county averaged an employment growth rate of 1.1%. Among the urban areas, St. George is anticipated to have the highest employment growth rate of 2.7%. However, on an incremental growth basis, in terms of number of employees, the increase in employment is typically higher in pairs. Next slide, please. I'll turn it over to Jamie, who will talk about the employment land needs.
Great, thanks, Brad. Okay, so now that you've heard a bit about the supply and the demand, we're going to get into the land needs analysis for Brant. And on the next slide, what this slide does is it tries to take something that's really complicated and present it in a way that's a little less complicated, but there's still a lot going on. I do appreciate that. When you look at employment, it's important to note that employment can be looked at in the form of sectors, like manufacturing versus retail, but planners typically look at employment in terms of land use categories, like Brad just pointed out, like population related and employment land, employment and rural. But what we really want to know is, where is this employment going to fall on the ground? And so what this slide is doing is it's showing where the employment is actually going to be located on the ground geographically. So, and we're just focusing on the employment land employment, because that's really the focus of tonight's presentation, and those areas in blue. So as Brad mentioned, over the 21 to 2051 period, we're looking at just under 10,000 jobs. And when we take those jobs overall, now again, looking at all employment, about 3,600 of those jobs, or just over a third, are going to be located in community areas, so in the yellow areas. And then about 6% are anticipated to be located in rural areas. And in those rural areas, you have rural employment areas, and you have other rural lands like farms. So we've identified about 600 jobs in the rural areas, and then the remaining 58% of the jobs are going to urban employment areas, those areas that we identified in blue. And then within those urban employment areas, most of that development will be industrial, we anticipate, but you'll also have commercial uses, such as predominantly multi-tenant commercial type facilities, and some employment supportive uses. Like we need things like small scale ancillary retail and potentially restaurants and those types of things to help serve the needs of the employers within these employment areas. And so that's the total amount of employment in employment areas. So then when we add the existing base, looking below at 5,300 jobs in employment areas, and we add the 5,700, we get a total of 11,000 jobs that we anticipate we'll have in employment areas by 2051. But we're planning for an increment of just under 6,000. Next slide. So if we take that increment of 5,700 and we divide it by our density of 15 jobs per hectare, we get a land need of 384 gross hectares. Now, we did hear tonight that density is low, and we do appreciate that the densities in Brant County for employment areas are not high. And that's, I think, for several reasons. If we look today at the densities in Brant County, they're around, I believe in the urban areas, around 14 jobs per hectare. the overall trends in density across most areas of the GTHA and Greater Golden Horseshoe Outer Ring are typically not going up. There are pressures on both sides. You see pressures for downward trends in density because of automation in the manufacturing sector, and you see a lot more demand in land extensive uses related to warehousing and logistics, which is putting downward pressure. In other areas of the GTHA and larger centers where they're accommodating more office development, typically around major transit station areas, you're seeing higher densities, but we don't have major transit station areas in Brant. We don't have a lot of major office development in Brant, so there's not a lot of factors that are really pushing those densities up. So when we take that overall density assumption and apply that to the jobs, we get a need of 384 gross hectares. That's an absorption of about 13 gross hectares every year. That's quite a bit more absorption than we've seen historically, primarily because the county doesn't have a lot of market-ready employment land to work with right now in its inventory to market. And so the absorption levels have been quite modest over the last several years. So then if we compare that demand, we'll start with the demand in green, and then we compare that to the supply, we get a shortfall. So it's important to understand that when we look at that supply, we're only looking at the urban employment areas that I mentioned in Paris and the 403 Business Park, as well as St. George, but we're also netting out some of those lands that we identified that are not developable, areas that are encumbered by physical constraints, are removed, and there's quite a bit of that type of development in St. George. We've also identified that, as Brad mentioned, there's a long-term land vacancy. And so when we look at the way industrial development builds out over the long term, we know that some of the best sites develop first. Over time, employment areas become fragmented, and some of those smaller sites are left behind. You also have sites that are not for sale or lease because the landowner is not interested in selling those lands or developing them for employment areas. And when we look all across North America, we see these types of examples where you have land vacancy, you have fragmented parcels of land that are left behind. So it's important not to assume that every single parcel of land will build out over this horizon that's in the supply, and that's what that land vacancy factors in. So based on those calculations, we have a shortfall of 103 gross hectares. That shortfall is identified in Paris. We have a slight surplus right now in St. George of 103 gross hectares. Next slide. So we're now going to get into the conversion analysis, and we heard quite a bit about this tonight already. So I want to start off by saying that we're not going to go into conclusions yet through this study about the conversions. We're only here to talk about the process and ultimately some of the facts with respect to existing conditions. We want to hear from the delegates tonight, and we want to take the time to go through all the information before we come to a conclusion, and also talk to other stakeholders before we come to a conclusion on these properties. But to get into this, on the next slide, there's a process that has to take place when you're looking at a conversion. So what is a conversion? Well, so a conversion is when, for an employment area, it's specifically identified as lands that are designated as an employment area. If there's a recommendation to convert those lands to a non-employment use, like a use like residential or a use like mixed-use commercial, that would be identified as a conversion to a non-employment use. And so the provincial policy statement and the growth plan, they identify specific requirements for addressing conversions. And they typically require that these applications or considerations for conversions are carried out under a municipal comprehensive review, because we want to be comprehensive about how we look at our employment lands. We don't want to just look at them in a piecemeal fashion and not look at them to appreciate the cumulative impacts that we may be having on conversions if we're not looking at the bigger picture. So in order to go through this process in this more comprehensive way, the county did post information regarding the employment land conversion process on the county's website and identified a deadline. There was 5 applications that were received, and we've heard about a number of those tonight. And ultimately, those conversions will be reviewed and then finally reviewed and approved within the framework of the MCR under the review of the province. Now, I just want to mention one more thing with these conversions is that the province identifies a provincial framework, and they identify policies and direction, and they also identify criteria. Most of the criteria that's identified by the province is really based on the land needs. So one of the critical criteria is, is there a need for the conversion? So if you want residential, is there a need for residential? And is there a need for the employment use that you're trying to convert to? So if you convert that employment land, will you have enough employment land down the road over the 30-year period? And also, will you have an impact on the planned function of the area? Are there servicing considerations, cross-jurisdictional issues? Those types of issues are identified by the province. But there's also local issues that also need to be looked at, like the marketability of the sites, surrounding land uses, and that local context. Again, coming back to that issue of looking at the sites within the context of the quantity of land, but also the quantity of land. So the criteria that we've developed builds on the provincial criteria and assesses those local criteria from a more site-specific basis that we add to the review process to make sure that we've looked at it from both a high level and a local level lens. Next slide. So I think I kind of really went through that actually through this slide here. So I think we can be brief here. I think one of the key aspects here is that this criteria has been identified by the province and by the county because there's a real need to ensure that we're protecting employment lands for the long term. Sometimes the market may be slow to materialize, land prices are lower relative to residential areas, and there's pressure to convert for various reasons. But you have to recognize that these employment areas require they have specific location attributes, and they require specific infrastructure assets that they need to be located near for them to be competitive, like access to regional roads and foreign series highways. So once you convert an employment area, you don't get that land back typically. And so it's important to ensure that those lands are protected over the long term, which is why we put so much emphasis on this process. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the sites because you've heard quite a bit about them tonight already. There are, as I mentioned, 5 sites in total that are under conversion applications. The first one is the site at 67 Woodsley Avenue. It's about a total of 4.2 hectares. It's located within the Paris, North Paris employment area. The proposal here, as you saw tonight, is for a mixed-use residential area, potentially with an affordable housing component. It's within an employment area. It is within the employment area. It's not, I wouldn't call this on the fringe. I would say it's within the employment area, but it is surrounded by non-employment uses to the north and also to the west, and then employment uses to the south, and then there's the water tower use directly to the east. The next site I want to point out is site number 2, which is 326 Grand River Street. It's actually a developed parcel, but underutilized. It's also in the North Paris employment area. It's about 3 hectares in size, and it's occupied by a multi-tenant industrial building consisting of a mix of commercial and non-retail type uses. The site does offer quite a bit of potential for future expansion, given it is relatively underutilized. And right now, there's a proposal for a commercial mixed-use development within this area. If you look at the surrounding area, there's employment uses designated to the south and also to the west, residential uses designated to the east, and some commercial uses also designated to the east and southeast of this area. Next slide. So this next slide is we heard this one tonight as well. This is the Sharp Road lands. This is located in the southeast urban employment area in Paris. There's 2 sites that we heard tonight in this area. In total, these sites total about 16 hectares in size. There's a small site to the north of the larger site that you can hardly make out here, but the north of this larger employment area in purple. It's the southern portion of a larger parcel that is designated commercial to the north, and then this southerly piece is designated employment, and then the larger piece to the south is this larger 16-acre piece that I mentioned. It is also designated employment, and our understanding is that the conversion request is to designate these lands to urban residential over the long term. And so this land is also within an established employment area, but it is also located next to residentially designated area to the west, And there's also some agriculturally designated lands as well, you can see in the white, that also need to be looked at in terms of the surrounding land uses. So I think that's about as much as I'll say about that site tonight. And then the last big site we heard tonight is the Cainesville area. So this is the Cainesville employment area. It is identified in our work as a rural employment area. It's not a serviced area, and it's not. It's the vision of this area is not to be planned within a fully serviced urban area, at least at this time. It is has a total land area of 84 hectares in total. Currently, the sites are vacant and they're unserviced. It's located south of the existing rural employment area of Cainesville, and surrounded by agricultural land to the south and also to the east. And the proposal, as you heard tonight, is an application seeking an urban residential designation within this area. So if we look at the next slide, this is just coming back to the overall big picture. This is really what the province starts us out as, to say, well, what is the overall need? We've identified we have a surplus of 395 hectares of residential land. So when we're looking at converting these lands to accommodate more additional residential land, we have to look at that surplus and say, well, how do we rationalize converting and adding more residential land to the county in urban areas when we already have a surplus of 395? So that's our starting point, and that has to be rationalized. It's not to say that we can't rationalize that, but it has to be rationalized through the land needs assessment. On the other hand, we have a shortfall of 103 hectares of employment land that also has to be rationalized. So if we're going to be converting employment lands and we have a shortfall, we're going to be exacerbating that shortfall. So is that a good thing? I don't want to conclude tonight, but you have to look at it from, again, a quantity perspective and a quality perspective. So are the employment lands that you have designated now in the right location? And if you're going to be designating, de-designating these lands, is what impacts is that going to have on those needs going forward? Next slide. So in total, we have requests for 107 hectares of employment land to be converted. All of these requests are proposing either mixed-use development or a residential type development. If we were to take that 107 hectares of land and apply our 40 people and jobs per hectare target that we looked at last time when we spoke, that would generate about 4,300 additional residents. So just under, well, around between 4,000 to 5,000 residents, depending on what sort of density, but around that 4,000 mark. So that's the sort of implication of if we were to convert all this land, not to say that that's something that we're going to recommend doing. So I want to now turn over to the issue of settlement boundary expansion, because we also heard about settlement boundary expansion tonight. And it's important to note in this, I'll go to the next slide, that the issue of settlement boundary expansion is not the same as conversion of employment lands. It's a different process that we have to follow under the provincial policy statement and within the growth plan. And so when we look at settlement areas, all settlement areas, whether it be urban areas, primary, secondary urban areas, villages and hamlets, they have a designated settlement area boundary defined in the official plan of the Schedule A of the official plan in the county. We're looking particularly at the urban system within Brant, which is again Paris and St. George, but those rural areas also have boundaries. A settlement area boundary expansion is something that involves when you're going to expand that boundary into lands that are not designated as an urban area. So they fall outside of that line of where we're defining urban, typically in agricultural lands or in resource development type lands. And those urban uses are typically developed on full services that are not typically at a scale that would be permitted in a rural area designation. So we have to justify these expansions through a series of comprehensive analysis, which is a major part of why we're here tonight, looking at the MCR. But there's also additional studies that have to be looked at as well, that are supported by provided by the Some of them are provided by the province. There's other specialties that need to be looked at, which I'll get into in a second, before these sites are ultimately reviewed by the province. Next slide. So to get into a little bit of the details, we mentioned that one of the major aspects of looking at a conversion is there a need for a settlement boundary expansion? And so that has to be justified through the MCR again, which is the core sort of aspect of the technical work that we're doing. Now, there's other specific criteria in the growth plan and the PPS that has to be acknowledged. We have to first look at, do we have enough designated lands to accommodate growth before we expand? And we also have to look at intensification opportunities. We have to ensure that we're not going to negatively impact phasing of development or cause leapfrogging. Municipal servicing issues have to be addressed. And of course, agricultural impacts also have to be addressed so that we're not exacerbating impacts on negative impacts on prime ag lands, and need to consider minimum distance separation requirements. All of these things have to be factored in addition to looking at the local factors that are not really detailed in the PPS, like the physical characteristics of the expansion area and how it ultimately fits within the overall surrounding land use and how compatible it is. And then lastly, we have to look at all of this within the context of the provincial or the growth plan with respect to excess lands. And this is a new policy that the province has introduced and modified in the 2019 growth plan that identifies that if you are going to expand your boundary but you have excess lands, then you have to identify what you're doing with those excess lands before you can expand. And so you have to show direction on excess lands. You don't necessarily have to down designate those lands, but you have to identify those within the overall hierarchy of the urban structure within a community area and employment area hierarchy. Next slide. So in total, there's 9 urban settlement boundary expansion requests that have been received. These expansion requests are all within the 403 Business Park area. And you can see in total, they amount to 345 gross hectares of land that could potentially be added if all of these expansion requests were permitted. As I mentioned, there's a need of 103 hectares overall, and there's for employment land, and there's a surplus of 395 hectares of community area. So again, these expansion requests have to not only be reviewed in terms of their local characteristics and attributes and all those other impacts I mentioned, but also within the context of this land budget. I think for now, I would just leave it at that we'll be looking at these, and we'll be developing a criteria to evaluate and conclude on our ultimately if there's preferred options for expansion, and ultimately what the recommendation would be to expand. But clearly there will be challenges. I think it's fair to know there'll be challenges to expand to the level of the applications that are being before you, just given that the fact that you have at the very minimum, you don't have the land need on the urban land requirement to justify this level of expansion. So I think that is a fair conclusion at this point. On the next slide, also wanted to speak a little bit to the rural expansion, because we heard about that tonight. And so, as I mentioned, the LNA looks at the urban system and the rural system, but doesn't really provide a lot of detail on the rural system. So it requires that we conduct a very fairly prescriptive approach to assessing urban land needs. But when it comes to rural lands, there's not as much rigor in terms of the quantitative analysis that needs to be undertaken. But there's still a number of policies in the PPS and the growth plan that speak to expanding areas in agricultural areas to allow for rural employment. A couple of those key requirements are similar to the residential or the urban side of the analysis, that you have to look at the impacts on prime agricultural lands. There's again minimum distance separation requirements. But it's also important to look at the need for those rural employment uses, but also the types of uses that you're trying to accommodate or looking to accommodate in the rural area. And generally it's the direction of an official plan, and in this case, no different in Brant County, that you're trying to ultimately provide a good fit of uses within the rural employment area that complement the surrounding agricultural and rural uses within these areas. So uses like management or use of resources, resource-based recreational uses, or other types of rural land uses that are compatible with the rural landscape and that wouldn't be appropriate in the rural settlement area, the kind of uses that you would be looking to locate in a rural employment area. Otherwise, we would suggest that those uses probably should be located in your urban employment areas. Next slide. So there are 2 sites that were mentioned tonight. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these sites because you've heard quite a bit of detail already. The first is the site that was identified by one of the applicants as the Green Life Proteins Limited site here north of the Cainesville employment area. It is a large request of 93 gross hectares of land. At this point, I think I would just note that it is a large expansion request, and when we look at the amount of demand versus supply, this is something that would have to be rationalized within that broader context, but it doesn't necessarily need to be rationalized to the same extent of how we're doing the land budgeting in the urban area, but we should still consider the balance of need within the rural area when looking at a conversion, or sorry, an expansion request like this. And then the second site is a site that's located in the New Durham employment area. It is a request for an expansion of the Stubbs Ready Mix industrial site. It's an expansion request of 32 gross hectares to expand the existing operation in this area to allow for future growth. So those are the 2 rural settlement boundary expansions. And to conclude and follow up on next steps on the next slide. Thank you. So in conclusion, we've identified a overall surplus, as I mentioned, in the community area land needs analysis in the DGA area. So we have a large surplus of 395 hectares. And that is identified to be in addition to what would be required to accommodate growth to 2051 in your community areas. We've identified a shortfall of 103 gross hectares to accommodate employment lands to 2051. Based on that shortfall, there is a need to consider settlement boundary expansion for employment lands. And given the shortfall of employment areas, there's also a need to carefully review the employment area conversion requests and the impact that those conversions could have on increasing that shortfall over time. And also looking at the local criteria that I mentioned that's been developed to evaluate those sites. Next slide. So in terms of next steps, we're now through the majority of the technical analysis of this MCR, which it's been a mountain of work, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to hear all the inputs. We're now moving into the policy recommendations component, getting to the strategic direction stage. We're going to be planning a special meeting of council on under Section 26 of the Planning Act in late May to provide those policy directions. Followed by that, we'll be providing draft recommendations on the employment land conversions and settlement area boundary expansions. That will follow by a draft land use assessment report in June of 2021. Then we'll get into additional consultation and engagement in the middle of June. It'll be virtual, of course, and that will then follow the preparation of the draft official plan. The draft official plan will be tabled at council along with the draft MCR in July of 2021, and we'll be looking for formal consultation on the draft OP in the late summer and fall of 2021. So that, I think, concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to turn it back over to Jen and staff, and we can address any questions you might have.
There are questions. Councillor Howe is your first, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Jamie, Brad, and I think Jennifer for this. Any report like this, especially the calculations of the shortfalls, it's by nature a snapshot in time. My question is, with significant demand for employment land between Hamilton and Woodstock and land deals happening constantly, how accurate are these numbers likely to be a month from now? Or if you calculated these numbers 2 months ago, how accurate are they today? And so that's my first question, which is I understand is broad. And then more importantly, as we go through the next steps towards a draft MCR and I'm just wondering if we're using numbers that are constantly changing to assess our employment land shortfalls. This, I'm looking at the Paris one on your page 37 of your report, and it says shortfall of 103 hectares. If many of those pieces of land are gobbled up yesterday, today, or tomorrow, how do we shift with something that's changing all the time when we're trying to make decisions over the next few months?
Jennifer, who's going to answer that?
I'm happy to take that one on through you, Mr. Mayor. It's a great question, Councillor House. And I think, to be fair, I mean, it is a long-term projection. If you talk to most realtors, they're not going to give you a 30-year projection on the market. Well, we do spend a lot of time looking at that regional picture. And so it starts with the growth plan. And I guess if some of it, for all its shortcomings, it does have a fairly rigorous background report that identifies the bigger picture for what's happening with respect to the economy and the outlook. And trust me, I mean, I would not try to say that it's not difficult to sort out those types of issues, especially in the times that we're living in right now with COVID. But I would say that generally, like I've reviewed, I work all over the Greater Golden Horseshoe. I've reviewed the allocations and the overall picture for long-term employment development. I think it's aspirational, to be honest. Like the overall amount of employment growth that's identified in the growth plan is an aspirational target. I think particularly aspirational in the GTA because of the outward growth pressure that you're seeing. And obviously there's a concerted effort to keep more growth inside the GTHA and not create further outward growth pressure. So when I look at the numbers for Brant, I think they are realistic, and we spent a lot of time rationalizing those numbers back in December to identify. We know they're minimums, but also is there a potential that we think there's more growth that could happen in Brant? And at the moment, we didn't feel from the technical work that there was a good justification to go higher. And ultimately, that was a key discussion in December to accept those numbers in the growth plan as the minimums. And so then once you accept those numbers, then you have to then work at all the details of breaking down the employment by sector and land use category and density. And along the way, there's all sorts of assumptions. And I think the only fair response is that it's very comprehensive, it's very rigorous, but it needs to be monitored. You need to have regular monitoring tools. Like we're not only developing a big, large report, but we've developed a database that the county now has to assess its employment inventory. We've mapped all your employment inventory. We've looked at all the existing conditions and trends that are driving growth and density. And this is why you have the opportunity to update your official plan. Obviously, there'll be a number of updates within this 30-year plan. And so I think it's important to monitor, but it's also important not to just plan for the minimum amount of growth, which is what the growth plan is recommending, and ensure that you've got the right tools in place to ensure that you're designating an appropriate amount of land. You can even designate, the PPS allows you the ability to identify lands beyond the 2051 horizon in strategic areas to protect. So you can't designate beyond that 51 horizon, but you can identify areas that you want to preserve and protect for future employment growth. And then the other real important thing is the issue of having market-ready land. So that's where the real competitiveness comes in, because you need to make sure that you've got lands that are either serviced or serviceable in the near term. And that gets a little harder because that's not all within your control. But again, there's policies that you can look at to help encourage that. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
Thank you. Quick follow-up, Mr. Mayor.
Yep.
Through you, and I'll be quick. Thank you for the complex answer, and it's a complex topic, and I respect the voices we heard in delegations earlier tonight, and we will continue to hear voices with different perspectives on the whole subject, and I respect that too. It seems to me that if we underestimate the amount of employment land that there's going to be demand for, we're going to miss an opportunity to provide jobs for people who live here. And I just think that's something we're just going to have to be careful. And things change constantly. And I just think as we go through the process over the next few months, I think it's something we're going to have to look at closely. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Pierce and then Councillor Gatward, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you. Yeah, first of all, to everybody that did any work on this report, thank you very much. There's a ton of good information in here, and I think it would be surprising to a lot of people in the public that read this report. So again, thank you. Two quick questions I have. When you talk of prime agricultural land, is that class 1 or class 1, 2, and 3? What is classified as prime?
Yeah, my understanding through you, Mr. Mayor, is it's class 1 to 3 agricultural lands are identified as prime.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Now, when you do the numbers there of the urban and rural employment lands and the delegations that we had earlier today that are looking to change the designation of employment lands to some residential, are those lands included in the employment numbers as of now, or are they kept out because there's potential changes to them?
Again, through you, Mr. Mayor, those lands that are identified under conversion, if they're designated lands, so some of them are designated urban and others are designated rural. So the lands that are designated urban employment are included in the urban employment inventory, and the lands that are rural in the rural. So we don't remove them until there's a decision to actually take them out of the designation.
Okay, now I appreciate that, because if we're already short and we're looking to take more out, that's going to make it even shorter. So I just wanted to make that point clear, is the fact that those lands are included in those numbers. So if in fact any decision is made on those, it's going to reduce, or it's going to increase that 103 hectare shortage even more. So thank you very much. And again, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pierce. Councillor Gatward, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, Brad, you mentioned earlier that the numbers were done up to mid 2020, and there has been changes since mid 2020 to the employment land inventory. I'm sure Jennifer has conveyed that to you. Have those changes been worked into these numbers? Because that's almost a whole year already.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Gatward, I can take that first. So as Brad alluded to in the presentation, also Jamie, the numbers in terms of building permits were provided up to February of this year. So we were crunching numbers up until then, and then the vacant land inventory as well. So it was from December 31st, 2020, but we've also added various parcels since then that have been taken out of inventory. And I've also been contacted by several landowners this week as well, saying that, you know, there's been some changes. So that's why this is preliminary analysis tonight. And as you know, there's a very large project at the 403 Rest Acres corridor, and that could take out a very large swath as well in the very near future. So we're aware of those changes as well. But as Jamie alluded to, like in terms of the need itself, it's a complicated analysis, but we have to look at the vacant lands and what is defined as vacant, because it's not just like no one's on the site. It's more things than that. But yes, we're trying to keep on top of those numbers, and we are aware of the big changes coming and also some tweaks that we have to make. So thank you.
Thank you. And my follow-up question, or my next question, is with respect to the, we heard that the Green Life Protein lands that are beside the old 403 and on the north side of Highway 253 are Class 4 farmland. But we forgot, or I forgot to ask the gentleman, the first presenter, who is representing the large swath down further south on County Road 18. What class of farmland, can anyone answer, is that huge parcel of land?
Through the mayor to Councillor Gatward, are you talking about the Weston Consulting presentation by the Sorbera lands?
Yes.
Well, right now that's actually designated employment lands, even though the underlying zoning is agricultural.
Right.
But they are a lower class. I believe it's Class 4, but I'll have to ask Weston. I'll confirm with Robert from Weston and Sorbera.
Okay.
But it's designated employment lands, not designated agriculture, I guess is the point. It's
Right.
not prime ag, so yeah.
Right, it is. And they do grow crops. I drive by there all the time. I just was curious what class that was. And it could continue as farmland until such time as they found an industrial customer that was suitable to go on that site. And because there's no servicing, we would have to find a more dry industrial type industry. Is that correct?
I don't know if General Manager Walton is available for a question, if he's there, but in terms of the Cainesville Class EA study that's underway for the Cainesville area, I understand, like as Robert Walters presented for Sorbera and Danny Dominicis today, is that there will be servicing to that area in the future, to the Sorbera lands for IC&I at the moment for the size of the pipe. I don't know if General Manager Walter is available. If not, that's what I understand.
Okay, I knew we were doing Cainesville, but I'll listen to Rob's response. Thank you.
Through the mayor to Councillor Gatward, that area is being considered for servicing as part of this, as part of the Cainesville study. And the agreement with Brantford to extend services out includes this entire area for industrial uses.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Ferrier and then Councillor Chambers, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, I think to Jennifer Boyer, if that's all right. My question is going back to a little bit of the discussion we had around affordable housing related to employment lands. However, we hear constantly from current large industry and medium-sized industry in our community that one of the things that is stopping their growth is often the lack of affordable housing for the positions that they would be hiring for in our community. So I'm wondering if we can talk about this further in the OP maybe, but I mean, I worry greatly about the idea of creating a bunch of employment lands that then are not serviced by people who live and work here, which creates its own issues, because we have a lack of affordability in the housing piece. So we hear directly from big employers here, I would expand, but I don't have access to employees because they have to live too far away in order to work, especially starting at some of these companies. So can we talk a little bit about that piece and how we in the OP can deal with that to help not have employment lands sort of sit fallow because of a workforce issue?
All right, thank you very much. Through the Mayor to Councillor Laferriere. That's actually an excellent question, and I'm glad you brought that up. And if anyone else from senior management wants to jump on, maybe Pam wants to jump on after me. And I've actually talked to quite a few smaller rural municipalities adjacent to us, and actually Stratford is dealing with this very much case. They cannot get workers, and there's nowhere for them to live. And so a lot of the factories are trying to build some sort of housing on site even. And I think really what it comes down to is it's part of the complete communities framework with the growth plan, because the population forecasting and also the jobs created have to go hand in hand, and you have to actually find somewhere for them to live. And right now is, you know, the term attainable housing, we do have a great lack, and also in terms of affordable housing as well. And the one issue with our employment land designations right now with our current structure is they're very open, and in terms of the actual jobs created, because if you create a warehousing space with very minimal jobs, with low paying wages, that's not going to attract like a workforce, and they're going to have to come from beyond, because really there's nowhere for people to live in terms of those wages. So it's all related to actual, you know, what jobs are created, what type of industry are you attracting, what wages are these people being paid? Are they prestige jobs, manufacturing, or is it warehousing? So it's a dichotomy. And then affordable housing, as you know, we've talked a lot that, you know, the county's really got to up their game on the affordable housing policies for our OP, and then really trying to do that. So it's part of the complete communities framework, and that's a key piece. And in terms of how population relates to jobs, so I think this needs further discussion moving forward, because the current official plan does not classify the types of employment. It just has a very loose definition. So we need to create 4 different categories of employment lands to attract well-paying jobs and where we're going to house them. So.
Thank you. Pam, anything to add to that?
Thank you, Mayor Bailey. The only thing that I would add to Jen's comments are it's not only our industrial sector that's looking for attainable and affordable housing, but we should be reminded that we are in a rural community, and it is also our agricultural sector that seeks out attainable and affordable housing too. And on that note, I would just like to clarify a couple comments. There's been a couple questions by councillors this evening about class 1 to 3 prime agricultural lands. And just to clarify, the Canadian land inventory is class 1 to 7. Class 1 to 3 are prime. They are the most pristine lands to grow crops, but it does not mean that class 4 to 7 cannot grow crops. The majority of the lands in the county of Brant are prime 1 to 3.
Thank you. Councillor Chambers, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have basically 2 questions. I'm wondering, probably the first one to Jennifer, could you explain in a little bit more detail what the PSEZ is all about?
All right, thank you very much. Through you to Councillor Chambers, I appreciate that comment. So it's a provincially significant employment zone, and it's a designation that the province gives in terms of prestige priority employment areas. Unfortunately, the County of Brant does not have one, but Brantford has 2 down the road. And what it is actually a designation the province puts around a certain area of employment lands, and it's a protectionism measure. So it actually protects land from future conversions. It protects them for corridor protection in terms of actual job creation. And it's actually based on a growth center model. And as you noted in the report, that we asked the province in 2019 in October to have them look at the 403 Rust Acres corridor as a PZ, as it's called. And we're still waiting to hear back, but we do have a meeting with the Ontario Growth Secretariat next Friday, and we'll be bringing this up. So it's something that the county would like to consider, especially for priority areas in terms of protection of the corridor. So.
And a comment to that, if there's anything that the council can do to encourage that, we should be doing it, I would think. And it's interesting that I'm just becoming aware of that now. The 403 corridor, particularly Rest Acres Road, is, in my mind, a pretty significant area for Brant County. I don't know if it's provincially significant, but I would expect that it would be. And thank you for the answer to that. And if you could keep us informed on how that plays out, I think it would be valuable to the council. The second question, my final question, is based on a simple fact that I believe we would all agree that industrial development, employment land development is good. We need it. And if it's good and we need it, the more we have of it, the better. And my question is to whoever can answer it, what can we do to encourage, through our official plan, industrial employment land development? It's nice to have vacant land, but I would like to have no vacant land, and I would like to have the vacant land that we have not vacant in as short a time as possible, because that would greatly enhance the prosperity of Brant County. So it's all well and good to identify vacant land and conversions, etc., but we need to be cognizant and take advantage of the times where there is a demand, and we see that at our Rest Acres Road interchange, what's going on right now in the new lands just to the east of the interchange. So who wants to handle that question? It's nice to identify vacant lands and do a marvelous analysis, but we need to make it come to fruition in as short a time as possible in order to take advantage of the times, etc. So who wants a shot at that?
I see Alice.
Through the Mayor to Councillor Chambers, I could ask Allison Newton or our CA Michael Bradley if they would like to respond, because I know that Allison has many conversations every day with many customers about the land and demand in different industries. I don't know if Allison is available.
Yep, she's here.
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. We certainly have the demand. You're correct. I was not anticipating the amount of demand, particularly during COVID, that we see right now. So we could certainly fill a huge amount of land in a short period of time. I would suggest that one of the biggest constraints we have of making that happen would be full servicing on those lands. Typically, when we have a user at the table and they're ready to develop, they want shovel-ready land. We do have some, and we do have a plan to get more on board, and that was alluded to in the report that came forward for your consideration a couple of months back, talking about Project Evergreen and the broader plan for Southwest Paris to look at the infrastructure requirements and servicing on those sites to ensure that we do have more shovel-ready land in the pipeline and ready for these investors and developers and companies to start and get in the ground as soon as possible.
If I can just make a comment, and I'd like the consultant to answer this or at least comment on this. When we first envisioned the Brant Industrial Park, we talked in terms of a build out in 20 years and forecasted it and did analysis, et cetera, for a 20-year build out. Well, in fact, it built out in less than half that time. So if the consultants can convince me that the vacant land that they are saying that we need if that is underestimated as what we underestimated our Brant Industrial Park, we're going to be sitting here 10 years from now saying that we need more land than what we thought we needed back in 2021 when we all sat here on a Zoom meeting and talked in terms of 2051. So with the demand that is going on now, you see it all over. Convince me that 2051, we're not going to be still sitting with vacant land according to your projections.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's a great question, Councillor Chambers, and it's similar to I think Councillor Howe's question about how we evaluate the forecast, and it really starts there. And so I can only say that, you know, obviously I can't predict the future. I try very hard and I do lots of forecasting, but nobody can tell you that with a straight face that they know exactly what's going to happen. But when we rationalize the forecast within that broader context and look at the amount of employment growth, and then break that down to how much is going to go in employment areas and what the density is going to be, I feel confident that we have a solid, sound forecast. There's obviously a balance here to make sure that we don't shortchange the municipality, and there's a balance to make sure that we don't over-designate. So I think, to me, what I would suggest is that if there are concerns that we are going to need more land and that there's a risk that we're going to under-designate, then you need to protect. And you don't necessarily need to designate all that land tomorrow. You may disagree, but I think there's still time to consider how the demand is ultimately going to unfold. But you do want to protect those lands in strategic areas, particularly those lands along the 403 corridor. So the PPS does allow you to identify strategic areas for protection. Not a designation, but it would be some form of an overlay in your official plan that would say, these are the areas we want to set aside. And when the time comes when those lands are needed, and if that happens to come before 2051 or even before 41, then when you reopen up your official plan, you will have the ability to then reevaluate and rationalize the need for designating those lands. But what you want to make sure is that you don't lose lands in strategic areas to other urban uses over time. So I think that's probably one of your key strategies to trying to stick handle through this.
Thank you.
Pam, you have something to add?
Yes, if I can, Mr. Mayor, I'd just like to add on to Watson's comments that you know, there's a correlation in some of the information that Watsons have shared with us tonight about employment lands, and also from our previous meeting on, you know, residential density targets and high residential targets. We've talked a lot tonight about affordable housing as well, and I think that it's all correlated in order to make sure that we're utilizing our manufacturing and industrial lands. There is a need for residential still within the county, and particularly the affordable residential. So in order for us to be expecting people to work in the county of Brant, we need appropriate places for them to live. So we should be reminded of just the correlation between our resident needs and our employment needs.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor McAlpine, please.
I was just wondering if we've looked at spots and areas for micro businesses. So I'm just thinking plumbers, electricians, and I had a landscaper yesterday that was looking for property that they could have their businesses. Sort of along the line with affordable housing. So affordable locations for these type of businesses.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, it's a great question as well. You know, when we look at where the demand is coming in employment, we know that small business growth is going to be is and will continue to be the fastest growing, you know, area of the economy. I think to your benefit, you do have employment lands that are designated throughout different areas of the county, within, you know, different areas of Paris, those that are right on the 403 corridor, but other areas that are located more closer into the urban area of Paris. And so those could be good examples of sites where a small industry doesn't necessarily need to have direct exposure to the 403 and maybe looking for a smaller site in close proximity to where they live, for example. Now that might not be the exact situation, but it could be an example of the kind of market choice that you need to ensure that you're accommodating all different types of businesses by size and scale and by type. And so it really does come down to market choice and supply, and then the quality of that supply that we've been talking about. So a few suggestions that just start with on that.
Okay,
good.
Thanks.
Yeah, good. Councillor Bell, you're next, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Questions to a few folks, I guess. But thank you to Robert for bringing that thought up about the strategic questions we have to answer, because it's not all about the analysis. We, as a council, need to exert some leadership and some thought for the future that may not be contained within those numbers. But I'm a little bit lost by the sense that we're focusing heavily on urban employment lands, and we don't recognize places like Princeton and Highway 25 and Cainesville, which we actually categorize as priority employment lands. And my sense is that we may have underestimated the potential of those areas that are not in Paris or St. George. And in that respect, I would ask that Watson take a look at their numbers and do a double check, because I come to a somewhat different conclusion about the amount of land that we're falling short on in the Paris and St. George area. I think there are some inconsistencies between numbers in your presentation and numbers in your detailed report. And it's easy to have that happen, but these are discrepancies which actually increase the level of shortfall, which makes our problem a little bit more complex. In that respect, on the vacant land supply, I noticed two parcels. One is the Tiger Cat area, and the second is the Oak Park Road and Power Line area, which Lanka have just leveled. Why are they not included as truly vacant properties? I say that because Lanka actually have gone on to realtor.com or .ca, and they're actually looking for people to go onto those lands. So by definition, in my mind anyway, they are vacant.
Who can answer? Councillor Bell.
Brad, do you want to take this one, or if you can?
Sure. So as previously noted, we reviewed the employment lands, and this was based on a desktop review. The county staff provided some assistance by reviewing our work. Certainly we might have missed a couple of sites, and that's something that we can review. Again, for it to be considered vacant, there has to be the parcel has to be completely vacant. So there could be some parcels that are partially developed, and that would be classified as developed. So it's certainly something that we can look at.
Yeah, I would certainly appreciate that you take that check, because just taking the Lanka property, for example, it's 22 hectares, which if you use your 14 or 15 people density target, that might be 300 to 400 people that are either in or not in the calculations you've done, which is quite significant. And I would appreciate if we look at that rather more carefully. I think there's a big question I have around Cainesville. Do we consider it to be rural, or do we consider it to be urban settlement area? There's such an obvious question that we got posed by the presentations earlier. Somebody asking for the release of industrial land for residential, and then somebody asking at the same time for agricultural land to be turned into industrial land. That equation has to be solved sensibly, but I think we do need to step back and say all these other extra employment areas that we have, are we giving them full credit, and are we using them strategically to ensure that the county gets the employment that it needs. I'll leave that with Watson and our staff to think through further. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bell. Are there any other questions? Councillor Coleman. Got a question? No? Okay. And Councillor Miller?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question, just as far as the provincial government goes. You mentioned it in the report at the end, but are they involved in approving the land transfers from, say, employment to residential, or the expansion of the settlement boundaries? Do they have to sign off on each of those applications, or do we put, if we approve it as a council, we put it in our municipal comprehensive review, we put in our official plan, and they sign off on that? Is that how they sign off, or do they sign off on each application? Where's their stamp of approval coming on this?
Jennifer?
Through the mayor to Councillor Miller. So I'll take first the question on the settlement area boundary expansion review. So as Jamie talked about in his presentation, he did a quick snapshot of what is required for a settlement area boundary expansion request. It's a provincial process, and we'll be submitting our draft municipal comprehensive review and draft OP for review to the province. So they will review that based on our recommendation and based on council's recommendation of how we want to proceed. As you saw, there was a slide Jamie talked about the criteria of the review. It has to be a county-wide review. So the province is looking to ourselves as staff and through our consultant. It's everything from evaluating the impact on the agricultural lands, natural heritage. We also look at, I also want to remind everyone that 403 Rest Acres on the south side is our Bethel wellhead. We have a wellhead protection area, and we have to protect key hydrologic areas as well, which is part of the review of water budget. So all of this is going to form a package to say, can we expand? What are the impacts? Do we need the land? And it's not just in one section, it's the whole county, and that's why it's called a comprehensive review. So that's the settlement area boundary expansion. In terms of the conversions, it's the same thing. I'll get Jamie to jump in, but it's based on our land needs assessment. So it's the LNA, it's the criteria, residential employment. Do we have enough residential, yes or no? Do we have enough employment, yes or no? And then how do you balance those? But Jamie can jump in about the quick conversion. How is that evaluated? And does the province review? Which is yes.
Yeah, my understanding is that they'll review the, as Jen mentioned, they'll review the MCR in its entirety comprehensively, and they'll provide recommendations and feedback and potential modifications on things where they have concerns with or don't agree with. So I think this is also a good question, though, for us to get clarity on some of these things with the province when that meeting's coming up, I think this next Friday. Because to be honest, there's been a lot of changes in the provincial legislation over the last several years. We had, the growth plan updated in 2017, and it was re-updated in 2019. And there are policies in that plan that have not really been tested yet, in my opinion, because everybody's going through this for the first time. And you guys are, I would say, probably a little bit in the lead in terms of where you're at in your process. You're not maybe the first in that line, but you're definitely ahead of probably the average. So we're gonna learn a little bit from the province in terms of how they interpret their own how they interpret their own policies and how we can work with them. So definitely will be very important when we get back to you on the planning recommendations component, because we'll at that point be really hitting some of these issues head on with the province, so there's no surprises when we get to this point of approval.
Okay. Okay. Let's just walk me through it. If we approve, like there was a couple I thought kind of made sense, especially as far as the TCA lands, but obviously we'll leave that to you guys, the ones that know. If you come to us, you say, you're right, it makes sense, and let's go for it. So we all vote, we say, yep, it's great. That doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It just goes into our MCR and then that's approved by the province. That's how I'm interpreting that.
Jamie?
Yeah, Mr. Miller, you are correct. That's how we're interpreting that as well, that we are making recommendations on the ultimate amendment. That's going to require an amendment to your official plan, and that amendment, all the cumulative amendments and inputs into that MCR will have to be reviewed within that context. So of the conversions, of expansions, and ultimately how that affects your urban structure and your land use schedules and other impacts.
Okay. Leave it at that. Thank you.
I think it would be good for us to follow up with your question though, just to make sure we're giving you the best accurate answer once we've had a chance to talk to the province on some aspects of their policies. I think it's important to recognize that it may not have been stressed enough in the presentation, but the province has an excess lands policy that is very vague, and it's not quite directed to your question, Councillor Miller, about the conversions, but it all impacts the requirement for how you deal with urban expansion within that context of excess lands. And so we want to make sure that we're interpreting that policy in the same way that the province is. And again, it's fairly new.
And the reason I'm asking is, I mean, if a planning application comes forward, just a regular one, and I know the process, right? We approve it, it gets approved to council, it goes through, or if we turn it down, somebody can appeal it. There's a process, and I think if one of these applicants comes forward and asks me to explain the next steps, I couldn't do it right now, even after your answers. Maybe in a year and a half time I can, but not right now. So I guess we'll learn a little bit. I mean, I've got a better understanding, but I'm still not 100% sure.
Well, through the mayor to Councillor Miller, I can elaborate just quickly. So basically at the beginning of June, we'll be coming to council with policy directions, and we'll be making statements like we recommend the county should expand the settlement area boundary in certain places on these lands for this amount, or we shall protect prime agricultural lands and no residential expansion. So they will come with statements, and then that will then direct council to say to staff, yes, we agree with this, go ahead and write the official plan. And that's section 26 it's called. With the official plan, I have to have a huge package to you, which is going to the province, which explains how we came up with our conclusions. And it's going to be big. And part of it is this settlement area boundary expansion. But I must say, as Jamie said, a lot of this is a work in progress. And we've actually been getting a lot of pats on the back from the province lately, as Jamie said, because we are actually ahead of the game, which is very great. They've been giving us a lot of compliments in the fact that we're consulting with them a lot. But one of the issues we've got is they are falling farther behind. The province is supposed to release agricultural impact assessment guidelines, and that includes the impact of settlement area boundary expansions. They were supposed to be out in February, and they're still not out. And I need them to review the impact of agricultural lands for settlement area boundary expansions. But we are working with OMAFRA. We have excellent communication. They've provided us some information, but that's just one thing that we need to evaluate. So, and then we go into the draft official plan, and then we get into the Planning Act process of amendments of each site. So that sums it up, a very complicated process, but it'll come clear.
Thank you.
I might understand a little bit better if this was 2 hours earlier in the day, but okay, I appreciate the answer.
Are there any other questions? Thank you, everyone, for putting this report together. It is a lot of work. And just your last example of waiting for something to make something else happen, I'm sure it happens every day, all day long in different parts of your report. So I'm looking for a motion to approve the staff report. Councillor Miller, I'm looking for a seconder. Councillor Gatward. Are Are there any other questions or concerns before we call the vote? Everyone's in support of the report. Councillor Bell? Can't hear you, Councillor Bell.
It's a pretty long recommendation. It's not just about approving the report. We're actually now committing to send this document to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. We're committing to have this as part of the dialogue and ongoing public consultation. So I'm not sure that maybe it's worthwhile for the people that are not on the call that somebody actually reads this out, because there's an awful lot of things we're actually agreeing to here.
Okay, Adam, do you have it in front of you?
I do, Mr. Mayor.
Could you read it for us before we call the vote, please?
Yes, of course. So the recommendation reads, whereas the County of Brant is undertaking a new official plan to be in conformity with the Growth Plan 2019 by July 1st, 2022. And whereas a component of this new official plan is the completion of a municipal comprehensive review in accordance with Section 26 of the Planning Act. And whereas a part of this municipal comprehensive review includes an employment land needs assessment to determine the land needs necessary to provide county residents with access to employment opportunities and to foster economic growth in the community. And that report RPT 2111, including the accompanied preliminary employment land needs assessment, be received for information. That staff be directed to incorporate the conclusions of the preliminary employment land needs assessment into the draft municipal comprehensive review for council's future consideration. That staff further be directed to undertake analysis and make recommendations regarding requests for employment land conversions and employment land settlement area boundary expansions as outlined in report RPT-21-111 as a part of the draft municipal comprehensive review for council's future consideration. That the preliminary employment land needs assessment be presented to the public for input and discussion as a part of the ongoing public consultation process for the new official plan, and that staff forward a copy of the preliminary land needs assessment report to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing for their review.
Councillor Bell, yeah, so it does seem like a very meaty motion, but it really is just direction to continue down the process. I don't know that it locks us into anything, or it's just so that they can continue. I would think when I read it, it did seem long, but it did seem like it was just sort of our blessing to move forward with the process. Councillor Bell, you're shaking your head.
I'm happy with the outcome. I'm happy that we've read it out. I believe it's important to understand the full extent of what we're asking our staff to do. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Miller, you had something to say too before we call the vote?
Just, I mean, as far as all the presentations earlier tonight, I like the fact, we don't have a blanket statement saying no, 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 no. The staff will be looking at them each one individually and judge it on its own merit. So that's another thing I like about the recommendation. So I will be supporting it.
Perfect. So we have it on the floor. We have a seconder. If there's no other questions, can I call the vote? All those in support of the report? Anyone opposed to the report? Looking forward to what, it's carried, by the way. Looking forward to what comes next. It's going to be very interesting. Seeing the report finished, I guess we'll go right on to going. I need a motion to go in camera, please. Councillor Ferrier and Councillor Pierce. All those in favor, we're going to go in camera. Thank you. And Adam, you're going to make sure everyone goes home safely. That doesn't need to be in camera with us.
That's correct.
Thank you. Perfect. Then I know Councillor Coleman wants to make the motion to adjourn.
You can do it yourself.
I'll second it.
That actually takes longer every time, John.
Anyway, thank you, everybody. Thank you for all your hard work to the staff that's still on the call. And good night.